Without waiting more, I give the floor now. Harald Leibrecht, unfortunately, cannot join us this morning for a welcome, but of course, SIPA has helped us as per usual to prepare this session, as we always normally we would be in the Château Portales because it's Castle Talks. Unfortunately, we can't do it this time. We will do it for the next Castle Talks again. So without waiting, I give the floor to Frédéric first and then to Joachim to address you some small words of welcome.
Thank you, Birte. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you, even if it's with distance. I hope that everybody is okay. We will have, as Birte told you, quite a long session on the very important question of migration. And it's right that migration, even with the virus, is still a very important problem. So I hope that we will have the opportunity to discuss it in this strange context, which is a global one. So it's not just a problem of European history, but also an international concern, and it's quite difficult with this virus just to cross a border, even if they are open nowadays, which was not the case in March, and that's why we had to cancel these Castle Talks. So even if it's open, we still have many problems to face. So it will be interesting to discuss with the panelists, but also with the different group of students. And I just wanted to thank all the students who have participated to this program, and they have also prepared some PowerPoints, and I just want to thank them because I know that it's difficult it's also a difficult time for students. So it's nice also to be able to have this kind of interactions. But I don't want to be too long, and I leave the floor to Birte.
Yes, and I will give the floor right again to my dear friend and colleague Joachim Beck, who has accepted also last minute, let's say, to say 2 or 3 words of welcome. Joachim, you have the floor.
Thank you, Birte. Thank you, Friederike. Thank you, dear colleagues. I'm very happy to be here again in the Castle Talks. I don't know which edition it is, actually. We have quite a lot of experience together. And what I find quite interesting is, you know, in times of crisis, we can really measure how good our relations are. It's very easy when everything is okay. Then you go to meetings, have your conferences. But difficult times like the pandemic really challenges us, and I really like to thank Birte for insisting to organize the Castle Talks even in such a difficult time. I know it is a very hard work to do so, and I think that our relations that we all build up as a network are very fundamental and good ones, and it also shows that the issue of cross-border cooperation becomes maybe more important than it was ever the case. And I'm very happy and glad to participate in the Castle Talks today. And yeah, I don't want to spend a lot of words on it. I have a small role in it, but you have all my support. And Birte, thanks again for this excellent work of preparation. We're very happy, and we owe a lot to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will just say a few words of introduction for the substance of the issue. The migration crisis has happened in 2015 in Europe, and it has resulted in a period of bordering in Europe, and debordering again, and rebordering. And this phenomenon was relatively new in Europe, but it was not as strong, of course, as the bordering and debordering in during the pandemic. But what was interesting during the migration crisis is that for the question of borders and border regions, I think we have to underline two elements. The first element is the question mark behind the two fundamental treaties in relation with management of borders and the consequences of the migration crisis on these treaties. One of them is the Schengen Treaty, which concerns the internal borders, and the other one is the Dublin Convention, which concerns the management of external border regions and especially also the treatment of asylum seekers in the European Union. The migration crisis has disrupted both of these treaties and has put a big question mark to how we in future in the European Union manage internal and external borders. And the current Commission under Ursula von der Leyen is trying to tackle this subject. The second issue that was at stake during the migration crisis was also an issue in general with the trust in European integration. In fact, it was the first time that there was a doubt about this ideal of a Europe without borders, and that scholars of European studies were concerned about not only the question of borders, but also the question of rise of populism, of Euroscepticism, and of xenophobia in Europe. And this was particularly amplified in the migration crisis. So I think that these subjects are still, these topics are still of great interest today for our Castle Talk. I've had in March already about 10 working groups from Americans and European students on these subjects. So they have already tackled quite a lot of questions. For example, the externalization of the migration question by deals of the European Union with external states, Turkey, Tunisia, for example, but also migration policies of different EU states, the consequences of the treatment of asylum seekers, the consequences on the border flows between border regions, and also the consequences on border populations and border regions in general. What has been highlighted with these PowerPoints in March, which we do not show today because we have a second promotion of students working on these issues, was that local and regional actors were left out in the management of this migration crisis. It was mainly the states and to a lesser extent the European Union which was concerned, but not the local and regional authorities. And this is of course a problem for border regions. And this is in fact one of the big questions that we are tackling in when we link European studies and border studies. So I hope that today with the student works, we have 3 masters participating. We have not the Americans because the Americans were not able to come to Strasbourg during the semester, but we have the Master of Border Studies, my Master Relations Internationales at Sciences Po Border Studies. We have the Master of Martial Libera on Europe in Globalization, l'Europe dans la mondialisation. I also want to thank Martial Libera that he has agreed on me preparing his students in my class on migration on these issues. So we have 5 student works groups from the Master Mondialisation and 5 from the Master Border Studies. And we have also 1 student group of the Master of Frédéric Béraud, the Faculty of Law. So we are very much looking forward to the student works, but I also want to thank all the speakers who have agreed to do keynotes and to bring in their savoir-faire on the migration issues, and who are most of them are already coming for the second time. They had prepared their intervention for March and they are now doing it in January. Thank you very much for doing this. And the idea is always the same during the Castle Talk. I want to insist on this. The idea is that we have keynotes from researchers and experts, and the students can then react. And in the second time, it's the opposite. The students present and the researchers are discussants. That's the exchange between students and experts on a topic in relation with border studies. I hope we will, this is the first time we are doing this online, so I hope that the discussion will work also via the computer. And now I think I have talked enough, and I would like to give the floor to Bernard, who is chairing the first panel on this issue, the introductory panel. Bernard, are you?
Yes, yes, I am here. Thank you, Birta. Well, it's really a pity that that the event couldn't take place at in the magnificent room of the castle. I don't know if the students will go to the Château de la Robertsau in the next month, but I think it's really a place to visit and to see before they're leaving Strasbourg. We have two speakers for this first panel. I hope I won't incorrectly display your name, and please excuse me if I do so. First of all, I will remember that 5 years ago, an exhibition took place on this topic at the Musée National de l'Histoire de l'Immigration in Paris, and it was a very interesting exhibition. It's really this issue is really not only a European issue, but it is concerning the whole world, I guess. So first of all, we will listen to Petya Tsvetanova. So you have the floor, Petya.
Perfect, Bernard. Thank you very much. You pronounced it very, 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 very well. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll share my desktop only for you to see my PowerPoint. Just a moment. I hope it will be possible. Okay, here we are. Okay, thank you very much.
You can remember us that you are working at the Mission Opérationnelle Transfrontalière. I didn't.
Of course, I introduced myself. Thank you very much. So I'm Petya Tsvetanova. I'm the legal expert of MOT, Mission Opérationnelle Transfrontalière, which is an association based in Paris, and we are working next to all stakeholders implemented in the cross-border cooperation on all borders in France, firstly, but not only in France, also in all Europe. So today I'm here to talk about this mobility of the migrants. Maybe I'll give you an overview and the main findings that we made in MOT about this mobility or the lack of mobility of migrants when they are already in Europe, already inside of a country, of a member state. So, first of all, this first slide is giving you just this overview, the main findings. I can tell you that we have three main findings about the situation of the migrants in Europe when they try to move between states. So, first of all, at the European Union level, the main measures are directed to the closing of borders and migrant roads. The second finding is that the EU framework is almost a soft and general framework. I'll give you some elements about this, but you all know it. You know, the EU don't have for the moment a binding policy about this subject. And the third point of my presentation is this, general finding also, that the processing of migrant arrivals is mainly a national policy. So let's start with this first finding, that at the European Union level, the main measures are going in the direction of closing the migrants' roads and borders. In the very beginning of this crisis, in 2015 and after, we had all these closures of their roads. So we tried, to stop the massive flow of migrants. So I'm not detailing. I'm not going very in details, because you see my PowerPoint, you see all these measures, but there were more than these 3 examples. It was really a general position of the European Union in the beginning to close borders, to close all these all these arrivals. And consequences of this policy, this main policy of European Union, is that some migrant camps emerged at borders with a terrible living conditions, and this the consequences of this was a humanitarian crisis. And also the second consequence I find, and we find in the MOT, it's that in this case, in this situation, we didn't apply this principle of non-refoulement of migrants, because they remain outside of European Union. The second finding about this mobility is that at the European Union level, we have these general measures, and soft measures. Everybody knows all these points. I tried just to give you an overview about the principal measures, which are coming from all this directive, which for the majority of them are procedural directives. The first one is this Directive 2013-32, which introduces procedural guarantees of examination of applications. The second directive is this one from the Directive 2013-33, which ensures that migrants will be recepted in human conditions, and such as housing and all these fundamental conditions of reception, and that their fundamental rights will be respected. The third directive, which is dealing with the arrivals of migrants, is this of 2011-95, which clarifies the grounds for granting international protections in order to improve the access to rights. And the fourth one is the Dublin Regulation. You know it, everybody knows it, which sets the criteria of establishing the state responsibility for examining the application for each migrant arriving in European territory. And the fifth one is Eurodac regulation, which regulates access to the database of fingerprints of asylum seekers. And what we can say about it, that we have only one directive, only one regulation about which aims to respond to a mass influx of displaced persons. this directive is this one, you see it at this slide, the Directive 2001/55, which allowed for a common response. This is the only text, the only regulation which allows for this common response to a mass influx of displaced people. It promotes a balance of efforts between EU countries in receiving people, and it's based on solidarity between EU states in this receiving, in these arrivals, massive arrivals of migrants. But outside this framework, no distribution of efforts with regard to the processing of migrant arrivals. So this directive wasn't ever been triggered so far. This is the main point. And what we can conclude at this point, that at the European level, when we talk about mass influx of displaced persons, when we talk about massive arrivals of migrants, for the moment we did not have this common response, never triggered this directive, and everything is treated on the state level. And this is my third finding. The processing of migrant arrivals is all based on national policies. So no harmonization between member states' policies, internal procedure for granting refugee status, and then on this basis we have a national residency, working and travel permits that are needed, and no recognition of the other states' national papers. So just a moment about this. I have to tell you something about this. All these 3 points we made in MOT. We made a study about the migrant mobility between France and Belgium. So we tried to understand what they are needing when they cross the border, and when they try to find a work at the other side of the border. We were only situated on the French-Belgian border, but all our findings are relevant for all French borders, and I think even beyond. So what we found that it was that migrants, when they have a status in France, this status is not recognized on the other side of the border, and when they cross the border, they need to begin again a new procedure. First of all, for this residency permit, and after, if they want to work, and in the main situation they want to work and they want to stay and to make their lives there. If they want to work, they also need working permits, and also to move inside the European Union, they need a travel permit. So I think it is maybe more difficult to be a refugee in Europe than to be a foreign people coming for tourism in European Union, because when you have a Schengen visa in European Union, you can stay inside the European Union for 3 months. But if you are a refugee, you have a status in France, for example, you can't move outside from France. You need really a travel document for every country you could want visit. So in France, I have made this slide is not very important for us for this presentation, because just an overview of the French system, you know, when asylum seekers are arriving in France, we have this procedure. We have to implement this procedure we see in this slide. So first of all, we have to take an appointment to guichet unique pour demandeurs d'asile, and after the prefecture is examining your situation. And after we have some organs and structures which are dealing with your case, which are OFI and also sorry, just a minute. Okay, OFI and OFPRA. But it's not really important for my presentation, because I want just to explain you that everything is coming under the national law, the national policies. And what are the consequences of this? The consequences are that no EU mobility for both refugee status claimants and refugees who have been already granted international protection by a state. In case of a move, new procedure and new documents are needed. And even in the case of these European long-term card holders, because we have this particular situation which is governed by the Directive 2003-109, which is governing the status of third country nationals who are long-term residents. Even in this case, when you are recognized as a long-term resident, when you move to another country inside of the European Union, you still have to ask this residency and work permits. And the conclusion, what is the conclusion? That the mobility of migrants within the European Union is neither allowed nor intended, and no common migration crisis management, except for the Temporary Protection Directive 2001, since it has provided a common EU response to a mass influx of displaced persons, but this was never triggered as well. Never been initiated at the European Union level. And at the MOT, at the end of our study on this French-Belgian border, we made a general recommendation, and we are now lobbying about this at MOT level. We are lobbying for a recognition of the status of cross-border workers for migrants. So in order to facilitate their mobility in these areas, in cross-border areas, on the basis of the provision of this Directive 2003-109, which is concerning the status of third country nationals who are long-term residents, because we have this Article 14.5, which allows for cross-border workers to have a specific status and to be subject to a specific provisions of national law. That is to say that under this directive, we have the possibility in each state to introduce a specific cross-border worker status, even for refugees, even for people who are recognized as refugee in a state, but we have to introduce it in the national law. And that is to say that, for example, in my study, in my French-Belgium study, we have these refugees moving from France to Belgium, for example, to only for work, or to change their residency place. And what is needed is the recognition of the French permits, the French documents. When they are already recognized refugee, it's not very, very difficult to do it. You have just to say, okay, the French system for us is really enough. It's safe enough, and we recognize their permits only for this situation, for these refugees who are already recognized as well, and they are going only to seek work on the Belgian border. But here, I think we are opening now a bigger box, of this legislations, because in this case, we are speaking about, the situation of the ECBM, the European Cross-Border Mechanism, which is not already adopted at the European level, but the mechanism is the same in our proposal, in our lobbying, the same mechanism, because only for this situation, the states are giving themselves a trust. They are trusting each other, and they're trusting each other in the internal procedure about the refugee situation, and to encourage the migrants' mobility within the European Union. That was my final point. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Petya, for this first overview of the legal aspects of migration at European and national level, and the difficulty to find a common answer to this issue. And thank you for respecting the time, the 15 minutes. I will now give the floor to Jula Okskay from Ceci. I think he is here. So you also have 15 minutes to your presentation. Jula, I'm not sure we can hear you.
Sorry, I'm here now. Can you
hear me? Okay. So you have the floor, Jula.
Yeah. Thank you. So thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm really honored to be a keynote speaker in such an eminent group of experts. My name is Jula Okskay, and I'm the Secretary General of the Central European Service for Cross-Border Initiatives, which is a smaller sister of the MOT. And I have to tell you that I'm not a lawyer. I'm not even an expert of migration. Our association is dealing with the cross-border cooperation, but I have to limit my statements within the confines of my knowledge, so I'm very careful. I think that Birta asked me to speak about the Hungarian position on migration because our Prime Minister became the portfolio of the Visegrad for countries regarding this issue, and I think that Hungary has been enforcing its firm and sometimes harsh position on migration during this debate, and I think that this is the reason why she asked me. But let me repeat that I am not an expert of migration, and I wouldn't like to defend the Hungarian position, but I would like to make it more intelligible for outsiders of the Central European situation. So I started to present my presentation, but it doesn't progress, so I have to change. So I splitted I divided my presentation into 3 parts, but I think that I will let out the COVID-19 pandemic issue because it's very illustrative, but it takes a long time. So when speaking about the Hungarian migration policy, we have to be aware of 3 factors: the status of borders, the Hungarian minorities living in the neighboring countries, and the geopolitical objectives of the Hungarian government. And regarding the status of borders, we can witness very strong fragmentation of states in the Central European space during the last 1 century, starting in 1914 with the Austria-Hungary Empire, with the continuation of the Paris treaties ending the First World War. And since then, and especially since the collapse of the communistic bloc, the region is characterized by an extreme spatial fragmentation. The countries became smaller and smaller, the borders have been lengthening, and more people became a border citizen, meaning that they live in a border area and they live in a border area, and their lives and living conditions are heavily affected by the state borders. Therefore, it is a shared interest to ease the border regime and to facilitate cross-border mobility. This is given by the Schengen system for some EU member states. But the price of the free movement of goods, capital, services, and people across the internal EU borders is a strict border regime towards the outsiders. As some scholars used to say, that it is the phenomenon of Fortress Europe, or Henk van Houten stated that this is the Janus phase of European borders. This is a different approach toward inwards and outwards. And now Hungary has 7 neighbors. 3 countries, Austria, Slovakia, and Slovenia, are members of both of the European Union and the Schengen zone. 2 neighbors, Romania and Croatia, are members of the EU, but they are outside the Schengen zone. Serbia is an accession country whose joining the EU is expected to be realized by 2025. And we have Ukraine, which has an association agreement with the EU, but whose EU membership is not expected in the foreseeable future. So Hungary has to apply 4 different border regimes in parallel. The second aspect is about Hungarian minorities. Hungary has never had colonies in different parts of the world, but the Hungarian kingdom was a quite large empire in the heart of Central Europe. And after the Trianon Treaty, 3 million Hungarians have been disconnected from the Hungarian state, and nowadays still some 2.5 million Hungarian people are living in the neighboring countries. It is more than the total population of 6 EU member states like Estonia, Slovenia, or Latvia. So it's a huge number of people who are very important when starting cross-border cooperation, because every time you want to start cooperating with the neighboring countries, you have some agents there who speaks both languages and who are aware of both administrative systems. So to take care of these ethnic groups is a constitutional obligation of the every time Hungarian governments, which is a controversial competence taking into account the territorial sovereignty concerns. But at the same time, these ethnic Hungarians are very important for us. So this is, again, a very important factor when speaking about border regime around Hungary. And the last point, the geopolitical objectives. For centuries, the room for maneuvering of the states in Central and Southeast Europe has been defined by the strength of 3 strong players, Russia, Germany, and Turkey. While Germany is overrepresented in the economies of these countries, they depend from Russia from an energetic point of view, and Turkey's influence decreased since the First World War, but it is expected to grow in the upcoming decades as it is one of the strongest NATO members and with aspirations to join the EU, inhabited by 82 million people, which is the same size as Germany. And Hungary's geopolitical aims have a double focus: to enhance the cooperation of the Central European countries within the framework of the so-called Visegrad 4, and to facilitate the EU membership of the Western Balkans countries. The first geopolitical objective is about the creation of an axis exploiting the geopolitical in-between situation of these countries between Russia and Germany, that is between the East and West, while the second targets the peace building on the Balkans, which is a very conflictuous neighbor of Hungary. So these are the reference points for assessing the Hungarian border policies in general, and during the 2 recent crises, the migration crisis and COVID-19 crisis. Let's jump to the Hungarian position regarding migration. So in 2015, approximately 1 million refugees and migrants arrived to the EU, mainly across Hungary in a very short period of time, causing a collapse of public transport system and sometimes even car transport along our highways. No, it's started working, sorry. So these are the maps I wanted to show you. So this is the map regarding the Hungarian minorities. This is the geopolitical situation and now about migration. This caused the collapse of public transport system and sometimes even car transport along our highways. The unrooted flood of migrants shocked the Hungarian ordinary people, lacking similar experiences because, as I mentioned, we had no colonies And in Hungary, the presence of third world people it has been very rare. So the people couldn't see even people with colored skin, you know. The government exploited these negative feelings and built up a very strong anti-migrant discourse, which is very effective in daily politics. The permanent messages of the Hungarian anti-migration discourse includes the following statements. First, illegal mass migration, which is, according to our Prime Minister, is coordinated by George Soros, the billionaire originated from Hungary, as a business in cooperation with the traffickers. And this mass migration means a threat to our security. And in the official discourse in Hungary, migration is always connected to terrorist attacks happened in Western Europe during the last 5 years. This migration means a threat to our traditional Christian values. So the discourse always connects the Christian culture and the Islamic culture within the framework of migrant discourse. And it means a threat to our Hungarian culture and identity. Viktor Orban used to speak about Muslim invasion instead of migration. The second is that mass migration results in parallel societies and no-go zones in the EU, where the traditional European values are not in effect. So it means that the migrants and the asylum seekers do not respect the traditional European values. Third, migrants should not be invited to Europe, as Mrs. Merkel did it in 2015 when she stated that wir schaffen das. Those getting to the road should be prevented from entering the territory of the EU without scrutiny. So they should be scrutinized at the external borders of the EU. And finally, the aid should be transported to third countries where problems motivate people to leave, instead of transporting the problems to Europe. These are the main permanent messages which have been echoed by the Hungarian state officials and state-owned media since 2015. And Prime Minister Viktor Orban said the Hungarian position in 2015, which hasn't changed since then. First, according to the official Hungarian narrative, the EU failed because it was not able to keep the UK in and the migrants out. At the same time, many national governments, especially Hungary and the V4 countries, whose policemen assist the Hungarian border control at our southern borders, proved their ability to tackle similar challenges. Consequently, the right of decision over migration policy should be kept at national level. In compliance with this attitude, Hungary refuses to accept refugees and to adopt a sharing system of migrants based on European quotas. They think it is completely useless because no one would like to live in Hungary, in Bulgaria, or in Romania. The asylum seekers would like to live in Germany and in Sweden. In 2017, the Court of Justice of the European Union made a judgment against Hungary and 3 further Central European countries for their refusal of the quotas. Second, according to the Hungarian government, the right policy consists of assisting the people being in trouble in their homeland, since originally nobody wants to leave their home. Therefore, refugees are welcomed in Hungary only if their life is endangered in the neighboring countries. And the Hungarian argument is always built upon the allegation that a refugee coming from Syria is not endangered anymore in Turkey, Bulgaria, Serbia, so Hungary should not be obliged to accept them. Besides, the government launched the Hungary Helps program in 2017, through which the government provides aid to persecuted Christians in the world, from Nigeria to Syria. The total amount spent for hospitals, education centers, local economic initiatives since 2017 amounts to more than 30 million euros. For instance, one of my friends have a hydrogeological firm, and they are working in Tanzania now with the financial support of the German and the Hungarian governments in order to find drinkable water. Or there is a Hungarian ophthalmologist in Congo who operates local citizens and has become a very popular person in the country, and the Hungary Helps program supported the development of his surgery. Third, refugees and migrants should be halted in the territory of the neighboring countries outside the EU and thoroughly scrutinized regarding their claims, their past and future plans. As Viktor Orban used to say, we have to know who comes into the EU and we have to have the right to decide whether we want to live with them or not. So Hungary is in favor of ruled migration and strict external border control. Accordingly, the Hungarian government, which opened the border at the Iron Curtain in 1989 in a revolutionary manner, built up a double wired fence system along its southern border in 2015 and 2016, and 8,000 armed border guards are protecting this fence, including Hungarian, Slovak, Czech, Polish policemen and the units of the Frontex. The government set hotspots along the border where the applicants for entrance had to wait until their applications were assessed, either positively or negatively. But the Hungarian government did not provide regular catering for those staying in the entrance zone and kept those people among subhuman conditions. Therefore, Hungary has been punished several times by different international and EU institutions. Finally, in 2020, the Court of Justice of the EU obliged the government to eliminate this model. And finally, let me quote some leading politicians from the daily European newsletter of Politico. Guess who stated this in November of 2020? We should radically overhaul Schengen to rethink its organization, to intensify our common border protection with a real security police force at the external borders of the area, but also by strengthening the integration of our rules and the joint operation of our ministers in charge of internal security matters. We will increase from 2,400 to 4,800 police officers, soldiers, who will be mobilized to fight against illegal immigration. Fighting effectively against this Islamic terrorism means to fight against networks of traffickers who have links with terrorism or sometimes terrorists themselves. Very interesting statements made by the President Emmanuel Macron. There is another quotation from a young leader from Europe who wanted to make political Islam a crime. It was stated by Sebastian Kurz, Chancellor of Austria. The next one is Charles Michel, President. The training given to imams practicing in Europe does not sufficiently take into account our fundamental values, in particular freedom of thought and gender equality. There was a report in the Politico in November 2020, which included some allusions to the general view of CDU members in Germany regarding the migrants and asylum seekers. Yes, they are welcome to be part of Europe, but they have got to leave religion at home, saying the representatives of a party which has the name that this is a Christian party. Finally, the last quotation is from the same newsletter regarding very strange operations of the maritime forces of Frontex, making huge ripples by their vessels in order to keep the migrants, small boats, outside European maritime borders. So these are very interesting developments during the last year. And it seems that the discourse at EU level is changing and approaching to the Hungarian one, which has been permanently the same since 2015. The question remains, what comes next? Thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, thank you, Julia, for explaining us the Hungarian situation, its border regime influenced by the geopolitical situation and the complex history. This overview on the official discourses of the Hungarian government on migrations, and I'm sure it will open up questions and discussion. I forgot at the beginning to say that we have not 2 speakers, but we have 4 of them. So we will now listen to Anya Bartel, from the University of Strasbourg. So, Anja.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning to everyone. I just try to share my screen. Okay, so can you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes, it's okay.
Okay. So just maybe to present myself quickly. So I'm a PhD student in sociology at University of Strasbourg. And I'm working on the experiences of refugees in France and in Germany. And today I will talk about the Dublin Convention, so which was already quickly introduced by Birte in the introduction, and which is one component of the European efforts to build up a common European asylum policy. And as you know, it establishes the principle that there's always only one state which is responsible for examining an asylum application. And in general, this is the state in which the asylum-seeking person reaches first the territory of the European Union, or Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, or Liechtenstein, which are also part of the convention. And so while the general European border policy affects asylum-seeking people's possibilities to enter the European Union, as we also saw already in the presentation of Petja Teftanova, the Dublin Convention aims to limit the mobility once they have reached the territory. And so there's lots of discussion in social science about the Dublin Convention, but today I will approach it from a special angle, which is actually the perspective of the people who are personally affected by the convention, so the asylum-seeking people themselves. So this is the outline of my presentation. So first, I will give you more detail on the context and research perspective, and then I will show you how the Dublin Convention affects two key phases of migrants' experiences. First, the process of flight and choice of France as a country of settlement, and secondly, integration processes taking place in France. Yeah, but before coming to the results, I really emphasize that this research I'm presenting now is the result of a collective working process in which I took part together with my colleagues Elise Papp and Catherine Delcroix, also from University of Strasbourg, and which led to the collective publication of an article called Refugees and the Dublin Convention, from which I took part for the presentation today. And this cooperation actually is one outcome of a larger research project, which is called migratoire, and which is a French-German network of researchers in the field of migration. And in these contexts, we work with a special method, which is called biographical policy evaluation, and which has been developed, for example, by Ursula Apitsch in Germany and Catherine Delcroix in France. And this is a method which is based on so-called biographical interviews, which are long narrative interviews that we conduct with migrants, and in which they tell us about their lives and their biographical experiences. And this is actually the material on which our analysis of the policy effects is based. And this helps us to make visible how policy might affect, on the same time, several sectors of life, but also affect life courses over time, and to take also into account the subjective experiences of the people who are concerned by these policies. So the presentation today, and also the article actually, is based on 30 biographical interviews which were conducted by different members of our team. So our interview partners came from several countries, and they all went through an asylum procedure in France between 2010 and 2018. And all of them have been concerned by the Dublin Convention in the sense that they transited through at least one Dublin state before arriving in France. So, as I said, first I will show how the Dublin Convention intervenes in the process of flight and in the process of choosing France as a country of settlement. So, as you know, according to the convention, asylum seekers actually are supposed to remain in the country they first arrive in, but actually only very few of our interview partners fled directly from their country of origin to France, because most often when people escape from violence in emergency, in the first place, the logic of leaving a place dominates. And then often some months or even years later, the decision to go to Europe is slowly constructed. And then in many cases, it's only after arriving in Europe actually that it becomes clear in which country the person will try to settle down. So I will first give an example of a case in which the Dublin Convention had relatively little influence on this process, and then present a case in which it became really the dominant factor. So the first case is that of Saddam, who was born in Sudan in 1991. His educational pathway had been interrupted by the political situation in his country several times. And when his village was burned down in 2014, he left Sudan towards Egypt and then later on continued to Libya. So actually Saddam had not planned to leave the African continent, but as the situation got more and more difficult in Libya, he decided to flee to Europe together with a Chadian friend. Their boat capsized in the Mediterranean. They were rescued and brought to a refugee camp in Italy. And this is actually the moment where Saddam first came into contact with the Dublin Convention. So in the interview, he told me, in fact, I asked the people who had been there before us, so before in the camp. One of them asked me if I wanted to leave or stay in Italy. I said, I don't know. It didn't matter. I just wanted to find a place. Then in the morning, they took fingerprints. So, in fact, the other morning, our clothes were very dirty because for a month, I had been wearing them from Libya until we arrived in Italy. So I had a friend who was with me. He told me, I have 200 euro. We can buy clothes. We bought clothes, shoes. Then he told me, in fact, he's from Chad. He told me, in fact, I'm going to France. I asked him why. He told me, because I speak French. France is better. I don't know if France is better or Italy. I don't know. I said to him, so we arrived here together. We can't separate now because life is not easy because we are not in Africa. We are in Europe. So in this excerpt, actually, it becomes clear that Saddam made the link between the fingerprints, which are needed for the application of the Dublin Convention, and the question of finding a European country to settle in. But the Dublin Convention does not concretely interfere with his decision to follow his Chadian friend to France in the first place. It does not stop them from crossing the very heavily surveyed Italian-French border. And then once arrived in France, they followed the advice of other migrants to continue to the refugee camp of Calais in northern France. And actually, it's only after having passed some weeks in this camp that Saddam decided to stay definitively in France. And in the interview, actually, he gives two main reasons for this. He says that first, actually had the possibility to start learning French in the camp because the French courses actually were not overcrowded like the English courses, as there are many migrants in Calais who want to pursue their journey to Great Britain. And secondly, the French Immigration Office offered him a place in an accommodation center for asylum seekers somewhere else in France. And this is actually how Saddam arrived in eastern France, where he is still living today. And in contrast to Saddam's case, I now briefly discuss the case of Danielle, whose process of choosing a country of settlement was very strongly influenced by the Dublin Convention. So Danielle was born in Turkey in 1990. He was pursued by the government because of his left-wing political engagement and being forced to interrupt his studies. And so he left Turkey in a hurry in 2014. And as in his past, actually, Daniel had extensively traveled to different European and American countries. At the time of the flight, he still had a valid tourism visa for France. So he told me in the interview, luckily, I had a visa, still a valid visa. So I came to Germany first. Actually, my aim was to go to Germany, not to France, but I didn't know the details of the Dublin agreements. So I arrived in Germany first, made some interviews with some lawyers, and they said, you have to go to France because you have a valid visa from France. So unfortunately, I came to France then. I waited for a solution for a while because I still had the hope to go to Germany or somewhere else. But people said, France will be best for you because otherwise your process will be longer and longer and probably they will send you back to France. So I choose a place in France. So actually in Germany, Daniel would have had friends and he had imagined to continue his studies there together with them. But once arrived there, as you can see in the extract, the lawyer pointed out to him that according to the Dublin Convention, the country responsible for the asylum application is the one that issued the Schengen visa. And to avoid being potentially affected by the Dublin Convention, he follows the advice of the lawyer and applies for asylum in France. So in a country he does not want to be in at all. And so secondly, our material shows that beyond the process of choosing a country as a country of settlement, the Dublin Convention can shape refugees' experiences during the first months, sometimes even first years in France, and thereby deeply affect their integration processes. So in general, when French authorities identify an asylum-seeking person as a so-called Dublin case, as a Dubliné, he or she cannot apply for asylum for at least 6, sometimes even 18 months. And during this period, people have only very limited access to social rights, and they run the risk of being sent back by the police to the Dublin state, so through which they entered Europe. So several problems have been pointed out by our interview partners in this context, like the impossibility of feeling arrived after a long flight, the experience of losing time because of the prolongation of uncertainty, the difficulty to understand one's administrative situation, and the permanent fear of being controlled by the police and being deported back to the first country of arrival. And how these factors interplay becomes visible, for example, in the interview with Ibrahim, who's a young Sudanese refugee and who told me in the interview, "You must wait all this time. One should be clear at least, but they aren't. We don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. You don't know if today, because if today you don't have any money, you don't know what to do, you don't know anybody here. You can't even leave home. You might stay home because you don't know anything outside. You're afraid that if you leave, you might meet the police, get in prison. That's things we have in mind." So, and to come back to our two cases, so in the case of Saddam, actually, in contrast to Danielle, he was identified by the French authorities as being a Dublin case after his arrival in France. and therefore had to wait before submitting his asylum application. However, in the interview, he emphasizes that he had been very lucky not to be deported back to Italy, and very lucky also to have the opportunity to continue learning French from the beginning. So a path he had actively chosen in Calais. And Daniel, on the other hand, who was actually able to submit directly his asylum application in France, provides a very negative narrative about this long-lasting procedure. He says, it's like every day you're waiting. You're making plans for your life. Big plans like, I will start school somewhere, or small plans like, I want to go on holidays. I want to start to work, and you can't do anything. Cases like mine don't happen in Germany. Everything works better there. And also, I don't know, the French culture, the French language, anything about French, I don't like it. Also, the German language was much easier for me to learn. So you see that the asylum procedure reinforces his impression of being stuck in France against his will. And he still imagines Germany, so where he could not go because he imagined the consequences of the Dublin Convention as a better place for his future. Yeah, so to conclude, actually our case studies show that from a certain point, the flight process of our interview partners were mainly affected by their search for a suitable place to stay, so which is a place where it's possible to build up one's future, for example, through access to language, education, or accommodation. And in this process of choosing a country, the impact of the Dublin Convention varies. So we saw that in Saddam's case, it had relatively little influence on his journey to France. And in Daniel's case, it hindered him from going to Germany, where he actually wanted to be so desperately. And in general, after having arrived in France, being in a Dublin procedure, being a so-called Dublin case, leads to a substantial prolongation of the waiting time, which is already induced by the asylum procedure, and which makes the phase where the stay in France is experienced as uncertain, sometimes even unsafe, as longer. However, for people who experience their presence in France as their own choice, it is easier in this context to make positive plans, like we saw it in the case of Saddam. And for those who experience their presence in France as involuntary, like in the case of Danielle, this is much more complicated. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anja, for your presentation. In fact, you showed us the contradiction between law, which provides a general framework, and the situation of migrants, which are personal and individual. And we saw that the legal aspects have consequences on the experience of the migrants. And this can be very painful. Okay, we will now listen to Noriko Suzuki from Waseda University in Tokyo. So, Noriko, you have the floor now. Noriko, I don't know if you are speaking because we don't hear you. We can't.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, it's okay now. Fine,
okay,
thank you.
Thank you very much for organizing to meet, and I am very happy to join you from Tokyo. So, could you read this slide? Yes. So, So since the summer of since the summer of 2015, many migrants, mainly from Syria, made their way to Europe, while few refugees have come to Japan. The Japanese government has officially stated that it is not a host country for immigrants and has been criticized for not accepting refugees in line with other developed countries. In this presentation, composed by two parts, I will show you the Japanese government's response to the refugee crisis by explaining its refugee and immigration policies. Then my student, Mr. Ageta, will present specific problems relating to the technical intern training program. So at first, please check the number of refugees in the world and of asylum applications. Oops. Yeah. So while Germany and other European countries have faced big challenge of millions of migrants and refugees, mostly coming from Syria, since the summer of 2015, the Japanese government has rarely accepted and recognized refugees. Although the number of asylum seekers has increased in Japan, like this number is in 2015, so gradually increasing. But the number of recognized refugees remain very low at around only 20 by Ministry of Justice. Why is the number of recognized refugees so small? This presentation shows the asylum policy of Japanese government and addresses the question about why the number remains so low. So this is the Japanese regime for refugees. In 1981, the Japanese government joined the Convention relating to the state of refugees of UN and its protocol in 1967, which came into effect in 1982. Under these international refugee regimes, Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act have been instituted. The Immigration Service agencies in the Ministry of Justice provide refugee status resettlement and financial support. The Japanese government has narrowed the definition of refugee and only accepts refugees who are recognized by the 1951 Refugee Convention. That means, Japan only accepts political asylum seekers. That's why the number of refugees accepted in Japan remains small. Only 20 people were recognized as refugees among 19,628 asking for this status in 2017, which represents only 0.1% the total. In response to the criticism of the small number of refugees accepted, the Japanese government has been trying to accept resettlements from Myanmar since 2010. In the 5 years up to 2014, only 87 people were accepted, compared to the annual acceptance limit of 30 people. The reason for such a small number of resettlements are as follows. Employment possibilities are important as selection criteria. Second, small-scale refugee communities are preferred. Third, difficulties of social integration, including learning Japanese, are expected. And finally, few local governments accept refugees. Furthermore, the Japanese government is focusing on giving financial support to international refugee organizations. Japan is providing large-scale funding with voluntary contribution of 20 to 30 billion yen to UNHCR and other institutions each year. In addition, it has pledged a total of 200 billion yen, including 97 billion yen to support internally displaced persons and refugees in Syria and Iraq. Saburo Takizawa, former officer of UNHCR Japan, insists that these Japanese contributions for refugees should be re-evaluated. Next, I explain Japanese immigration regime. Officially, Japanese government has not adopted an immigration policy after World War II. However, there were about 1,280,000 foreign workers in Japan in 2017. These workers are composed of foreign students and highly skilled foreigners that the government has recently promoted, and the permanent residents and their Japanese spouses and descendants, and technical intern trainees. The number of foreign workers increased after the Japanese government introduced immigrants due to the reform of the Immigration Control Act in 1989. This act permits residence status for Japanese descendants mainly from South America, the so-called Nikkeijin. Also, the introduction of the technical intern training program in 1993 has facilitated the reception of young Asians who wanted to work in Japan. This TIT program has many problems, as Mr. Ageta will show you. Although the number of foreign workers is increasing, the Japanese government has continued to make official statements denying their immigration policy. Therefore, public support and information for foreigners living in Japan are insufficient. Also, it is very difficult to live in the country and understand the public service if you do not speak Japanese. However, a decreasing labor shortage due to the declining birth rate, 1.36 in 2019, and aging population forced to change in the immigration policy. The Japanese government reformed their Immigration and Control Act in December 2019 to introduce the status of specific technical intern training, which came into effect in April 2020. This reform allows foreign workers with high skill and expertise to work for 5 years maximum in Japan. Unfortunately, the number of specific technical intern trainees is still low because COVID-19 measure has meant that people can no longer enter the country. There are some reasons for the small number of asylum seekers in Japan. First, there are some practical inconveniences as regards procedures. When asylum seekers ask for protection from the Japanese government, they must prepare their document in Japanese. Once they succeed in applying for asylum status, if they do not have the status of legal residence while waiting for the decision, they cannot work. This means that refugees' rights to live legally are not protected. Second, there are geographical considerations. Since Japan is isolated by the sea and far from countries where there is conflict, it is difficult to access, and the cost of visiting Japan is high. As regards the refugee and resettlement, the cost of receiving refugees is very expensive. As Takizawa mentioned, the annual budget for resettlement program for 30 people is 130 million yen, and this can help 40 refugees in underdeveloped countries. As such, the Japanese choice is reasonable. Due to these inconveniences, Japan has emerged as being intolerant to refugees, and no refugee chain has occurred in Japan. Although this intolerance for refugees is recognized, the number of asylum seekers in Japan is increasing. And asylum seekers having resident status can work, and if the application is denied, he or she can object and reapply. Thus, those applying for refugee status with the purpose of finding work are increasing among Nepalese, Vietnamese, Indonesians, etc. These foreigners continue to live in the country and are becoming the workforce in Japan. Thank you. So next, Kei Ageta, please start.
Okay. Hello. I'm just giving an introduction. My name is Kei Ageta. I'm in my third year of Waseda University, majoring in philosophy and sociology. So, can you hear me? And I'll show you my slides. Okay, so I'm very glad to give my short presentation here. And now I would like to begin my reports about contradiction in the technical intern training program in Japan. Since the 20th century, the Japanese government, including the previous and the present administration, has never officially acknowledged that Japan promotes the arrival of immigrant workers. However, since the establishment of the technical intern training program in 1993, we have to recall it simply the program. A lot of foreign workers have arrived as technical intern trainees. The Japan International Training and Skilled Worker Cooperation Organization states that the objectives and purpose of the program are to transfer skills, technologies, or knowledge accumulated in Japan to developing and other regions, and to promote international cooperation by contributing to the development of human resources who can play roles in the economic development of those developing regions. Therefore, the public stance in the country is to contribute to international cooperation and technological support for developing countries. In addition, in the Act on Proper Technical Intern Training and Protection of Technical Intern Trainees, you have to recall it simply the Act, which was enacted to improve the working environment of trainees. It is proclaimed that technical training shall not be conducted as a means of adjusting labor supply and demand. And as we can see in this graph, the total number of trainees has been growing in recent years, and almost all of them come from Southeast Asian countries. As we can see, like Vietnam, China, Philippines, Indonesia, Thai, and the other countries are also the South Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries. It is regrettable, but the realization is far from the stated aim of the JITCO and the Act. In actual fact, technical intern trainees in Japan forced to act like immigrant workers, moreover in worse circumstances. Firstly, the working environment doesn't comply with the Act. One of the purposes of being a trainee is to make a living for oneself and one's family, but the trainees have to be in debt to visit Japan in the first place. And what is worse, they can only earn low wage. According to an investigation by the Ministry of Health, the average monthly income of regular employees is 243,000 yen. It is about 1,900 euros. Meanwhile, that of trainees is 156,000 yen. It is about 1,200 euros. However, this is just the statistics. The real state is often far more dire. For example, a Vietnamese person who worked as a protester was constantly subjected to violence at the hand of Japanese boss. He had been putting up with it and received a low level of take-home pay. Nevertheless, he was finally fired before being able to completely repay his debt. And the purpose of being a trainee is to obtain technical skills. But the difficult work environment and the monotonous manual labor involved do not allow them to accomplish the goal. Secondly, despite such poor working conditions, the program has not sufficiently improved, as the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination pointed out on September 2020. In fact, as we can see in the graph of the Ministry of Health, 70% of corporations who take trainees in are violating the Labor Standards Act. Besides, though the number of violations of the Labor Act grew to 5,160 by 2018, but the number of actual declarations of correction is only about 100. Therefore, most corporations are ignoring the recommendation without any penalty. The trainees are recruited by the Japanese government to fill the shortage in domestic labor. However, they are not recognized as migrant workers under the present legal system. And that's why they do not receive the same treatment as other Japanese workers. As we have confirmed here, the problems relating to the technical intern training program are to do with immigrants in connection with the Japanese legal and social system. At the same time, there are similar issues with immigration programs in other countries. For example, the treatment of immigrant workers as objects and xenophobia or irresponsible behavior on the part of the government. Therefore, Japanese people should regard these present domestic programs in the global context of existing discussions about immigration, and make an effort to address this assault on human rights. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And these are my references. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this different presentation. Unfortunately, we don't have time to take any questions because we have some delay, but I would like to make a short comment on this, not on this different presentation, but I would like to add a geographical point of view about migrations. In fact, in geography, in the geography of population, we are considering that there are three places, three territories for migration. First of all, you have the place of origin, which means the zone you are living, because it doesn't offer you the means to live a proper life. The second place is a zone of destination, which is often a country. It is a country you wish to live, and of course, the country you are selecting depends on the representations you have, but sometimes also if you have link in this country, etc. And the third zone is the in-between zone. We see it often as a transit zone, but for a migrant, it is often a circulation zone made of difficulties, and you don't have a real trajectory here to reach the place where you want to live. And I think my question, and I think it's a very general question, is how can a legal and human policy approach to migration be reconciled? And I think I will, and of course it will be very difficult to answer to this question, but I give now the floor to Birte for the next step of the program.
So welcome back, everybody. I'm going to give the floor right away to Joachim for a short introduction of this afternoon session. And then we will continue with our castle talk.
Yeah, thank you, Birte. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your little lunch break, which definitely is has been an individual one, as is the case for all these virtual distance conference approaches that we are forced to apply. We will continue now this afternoon our castle talks, and we have a few moments, very interesting again, a mixture of presentations of academics and students. We will start with a short introduction on a first keynote session, and the introduction will be delivered by Bernard Reiter. And then we have two keynotes by Catherine Delcroix. Maintenant, I've seen there was an I missing, and I asked my son, is it Delcroix or Delcroix? But it's Delcroix. Or at least was my printing machine that didn't work well. And welcome at Martel Wenken. You will give keynotes, and we will probably have some time to raise questions, exchange a little bit on your two issues, and then we will continue later on with the presentations of the working groups, the students. They have really worked very well. I mean, we have 11 groups all in all. We will, however, change a little bit the issue. So in the afternoon session, we have migration, identity, and borders, exchange of experience. We will have then a migration, crisis, and human rights issue. And by the end of the day, from 6 to 6:30, if time is left, we will even have a little panel session, which will be moderated by Birte, and she certainly will also draw some conclusions at the end of the day. So my role is very limited in this afternoon session, so I just have to give floors and ask questions. I'm very happy to give the floor to Bernard for a short introduction.
Okay, thank you, Joachim. The chairman has always a very difficult duty, in fact. I will start this second panel with two keynote speakers with a short introduction. In fact, migration in relation to borders is a complex subject which takes into account different aspects and which can be analyzed by several disciplines: political science, legal science, we saw it this morning, economics, sociology, anthropology, and of course history and geography. I will just focus on how certain disciplines can be useful in tackling this subject today. History allows a temporal perspective, of course. Is the term crisis appropriate when talking about migration in Europe? Is it really new, or should we be placed in longer time frame, at least several decades? Geography. Is this not a global issue that concerns all regions of the world and all territories in a multiscalar approach? Are we not obsessed by the national dimension? the territorial trap, as John Monnet tells us, which prevents us from seeing that migration questions all scales. Should we not place it in a global context of mobility? We are mobile beings, as a pandemic that restricts our movements continually reminds us. The political dimension questions the borders and the role of public actors, the states, but also other public bodies, cities, region, as well as a civil society. Shouldn't border regimes be subject of a collective global discussion, of course, but also in the different regional organization of the world, the EU, EFTA, Mercosur, ECOWAS, etc. Shouldn't this question, which is also part of the political and economic geography, be the subject of international conferences in which development policies and strategies would be discussed, as well as security issues? Finally, what about a social anthropology dimension? Can we develop migration policies that integrate a human rather than a humanitarian dimension? Should we consider all migrants as people settling permanently on a territory, or according to a circulatory approach, the one proposed by the sociologist Alain Tarius and taken up by the political scientist Catherine Wittel de Wenden? Shouldn't we also act on the representations conveyed? In other words, how can we deconstruct the representations that aim to instrumentalize the image of migrants in favor of reductive or nationalist ideologies, Once again, the question is political. What means are being given, particularly in the EU, in states that claim to be democratic and respectful of human rights and the rule of law? And I'll give the floor again to the chairman, Joachim.
Thank you very much, Bernard. This is really a very interesting question, as you may be aware. We've been collectively also raising the transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary dimension of cross-border cooperation. But as you rightly pointed, when it comes to migration, this is even more. There's even more need to enter into an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary reflection on the issue, and it is complex, as you raised it. I may directly pass the floor to Catherine now for her statement, and you're welcome. I don't know if you have a document to share. Maybe Birte will.
Sorry, I didn't have the time to make the document, but I will send a PDF to Bert afterwards. So PDF. So okay. Now I will talk about the impact of local support and integration policies on a comparative dimension. I will give you a comparative examples of the situation of migrant families with incomplete rights in Strasbourg and in Frankfurt am Main. In 2017, the city of Strasbourg adopted a strategy to counter restrictive migration policies on the national level. Since then, local policies are devised towards becoming a nationwide French model of an hospitable city, on the same way as the sanctuary cities in the world for migrants. Politicians and civil servants have developed strategies to enable migrants to gradually enter common law. Such strategies consist in starting out from the legal status of one or some of the family members, mostly the children, to gradually complete the rights of other family members. Children have the right to protection and education, whatever their residency status may be. They have the right to housing and to attend school, even when their parents do not have residency papers or visa. Based on case studies of families, I will show in the following how the rights of different family members have progressively been completed in this way. I will compare the strategies of the city of Strasbourg concerning migration policies with those developed in Frankfurt and Main, and discuss how migrants, professionals, and politicians in the two cities jointly adapt to legal constraints in the field of rights of residencies, access to housing, education, work, and language courses, and at the same time also devise strategies to overcome or transform these regulations. I aim to thereby contribute to the discussion on the role of cities in current migration regimes and to substantiate the discussion by analyzing how the biographical experiences and action orientation of the members of migrant families reflect and contribute to innovative politics on the communal level. First of all, I will define what it means by incomplete rights. From a legal perspective, rights are indivisible, and it might seem doubtful to speak of incomplete rights. However, political strategies to complete less than full right of residence can be understood in terms of gaining access to rights. This can indeed prove very important and even life-saving to migrant families as a chance to gain and maintain residency, to stay together and to improve the social situation of all family members. Moreover, the notion of incomplete rights is sociologically interesting because it reflects an unexpected usage of the notion by an administration in several ways. First of all, we would expect a deficiency-oriented view from an administration, thus ruling out possibilities and options because of having only incomplete rights. Second, this would be part of an either-or perspective of having rights or not. But in the case of Strasbourg, the city administration, we find that the notion is used in terms of a process with incomplete understood and acted upon as to be completed. On a contrast way, if we go to Frankfurt and Main, we see that there are some similarities with Strasbourg. There was a recognition of the diversity of the population from a long time ago in Frankfurt. Already 30 years ago, an Office for Multicultural Affairs was instituted as part of the city administration. But unlike to Strasbourg, no stance is taken against a restrictive national migration policy, and there is no equivalent to the notion of incomplete rights. Rather, the term is applied in a usual sense of deficiency to rule out possibilities. However, there are a number of grassroots associations founded by activists that support migrants. In 2015 and 2016, this support proved existential for many refugees without access to official support because they had arrived in Germany without papers and or visa from another European country, and usually Italy, where they would have to return to under Dublin Regulation. The association provides them with temporary places to stay, usually at volunteers' apartments, and provide access to legal advice offered by other associations. At the same time, the association cooperated with city facilities that provided the homeless in Frankfurt with overnight stays. But it is much less organized. It is not a network organized by the municipality. Now, what does I mean by the methodology of biographical evaluation of policies in two cities? In fact, biographical policy evaluation analyzes the concrete effects that policies have on the biographies of individuals who have experienced them. This approach discloses how different policy fields, immigration policies, entry regulation to national countries, access to the asylum procedure, policies in the field of housing, education, etc., as well as support by associations, are knitted together in a life path rather than considering them as separate entities. Life narratives are also especially valuable to learn more about the courses of action developed by the refugees and migrants and the strategies they employ in order to adapt to or resist given policies. I will give you here two examples of families with incomplete rights, one in France and one in Germany, but a little more larger presented in France because I don't have enough time, but you will see the difference and you will see exactly what we mean in our group Migreval by biographical evaluation, because I choose two cases that I took in our Migreval database that we formed with our colleague of the Goethe University of Frankfurt. It was created in 2015, and on this database we gathered biographical interviews with migrants and their descendants who arrived in France and Germany from the 1950s up until today's. And also we have semi-structured interviews with professional politicians and members of the civil society supporting migrants. And these interviews are transcribed and we share them in a group of research. It's not open to everybody, but it's a very huge amount of important information in it. So to exemplify what I want to show you, I took the example of two fathers, single fathers, who have one in France, one in Strasbourg and one in Frankfurt, who educated alone one child. And these two fathers, they came to Strasbourg and to Frankfurt to stay, find the way to live, earn money and educate their children, help them to go to school and all this. And they were irregulated, they had irregular papers when they came in the two cities, in fact. Or they became irregular. First of all, Mehdi. He's 32 years old when we interviewed him. He was born in Morocco in a small town near the desert. His family, which consists of his parents and 11 brothers and sisters, is poor. he first migrated to Spain, but he wanted to go to France because it was his ideal country to go in. And he arrived in Strasbourg in 2008 by marrying a woman of French nationality in 2009. He could work and he was regular. But he divorced in 2013, and then he lost his papers and the right to stay in France and to work. After his divorce, he no longer had the right to hold a job in France, and he had a lot of difficulties and started to a trajectory of delinquency. After his marital breakup in 2013, Mehdi met a young Czech woman whom he started dating and with whom he had a little girl, Nala. She was born in 2015. He lived with her and her mother for 3 months, and then he went to prison. But when he went out of prison in 2016, he was very close to his daughter and he shared the custody with the mother. And he didn't have any papers, but he wanted to stay in France, to be a father of this little girl. And so he entered in contact with the network of the municipality of Strasbourg, who helped him and his daughter to live and to find a way to regularize the paper of this young father. And I give you some testimony from him. For example, he was very concerned by the fact that his daughter could go to school and go well at school, and so he was put in contact with an association that was built by the municipality network named Lapin Vert. It's not the real name because it's anonymized. And the Lapin Vert it's a kind of place in which people without house, mostly migrants without papers, they can come with their children to make meals, to wash their clothes, and also to speak to social workers, to get papers, for example, to have the right to be cured. L'AME, it's the state medical aid. For example, Mehdi could get this help. He could also get a place for his daughter to go to school. The social worker went with him to the school teacher. And so he said, for example, about this social worker, frankly, she's too nice. When I met to register, I called the school, I brought the papers, and we visited the school, me and the little girl and the social workers. And then my daughter was put in contact with a logoped because she didn't speak very well. And after that, she was really well at school. Then also in this association, he could be put in contact with a network of parents so that he could really help his child. And also he went to the CIMAD, and there he is helped to get his paper again. And I finished with his case by telling you what he says about that. Because he first worked in France, he had diploma in France, and he really wants to stay in France and to participate in France. I have proof, I have pay slips showing that I participated, that I worked here, and now I have a little girl. In fact, I have a large part of my life I spent in France, 13 years. in the end, I can't get a resident permit to have a stable life with my daughter here, but I am helped. I need this resident permit. I can't go back to Spain or to Morocco. All my family is in Europe. And so I am very pleased with the Lapin Vert. They helped me a lot. So to finish with the Mehdi case, just through the story of Mehdi and his daughter, we discover how the sectors of housing, health, schooling, employment, access to rights and others are interwoven into the lives of individuals, affect their life course and the strategies that people deploy to adapt to these policies. And we see that this network in Strasbourg gives opportunities to to people who have vocation to become Strasbourgeois, to be able to wait to get their papers in good conditions. And it is really a very interesting way of dealing with these new Strasbourgeois. And also, I want to say, to finish about Mehdi before going to Jason in Frankfurt, that he's working as a benevolent in different associations, proving that he's participating in the city. And this is also a characteristic of this hospitable municipality network, to make people related to other French people and other different aspects, with different aspects of life difficulties. Alors, the second case, but shortly, because I don't have a lot of time left, Jason, he's also, he's 35 years old. He's from an African country, in fact from Mali. He first came in Poland and he had a child with a Polish woman, but this Polish woman left him and his child. And the Polish administration said that he didn't have enough money to educate alone his son. The son was 4 years old. And then he decided to go to Germany to be able to stay a single father and to continue to earn money and to find a place for his son and himself. And so he arrived in Germany in 2015. And there was no network of the municipality, but he encountered volunteer association, and in these association they could give him a place to live for him and his son, but it was not forever. He had to find a way to convince the German authority to make his paper regular. And he has to prove that he could earn money to stay in Germany. But his son could also go to school, and he was an excellent pupil. But he didn't have social workers to help him in different aspects of their life, the life of his child and of his life. And so the difference was that they were militant helping migrants in Frankfurt, but in Strasbourg there was a really big social network about the life of the family. But what was difficult in Strasbourg was to regularize the paper. In Frankfurt, the militants helped a lot this father to regularize with lawyers on a private base. So to finish and to gather all what I just told you, I want to say that in the cities has an important role because a city determines everyday life. It is here where people feel if they are equals and welcome. And city administrations have immediate responsibility for the living conditions, successes, and challenges of immigrants. Local governments can succeed where many national governments are challenged or even fail. So, if I summarized to finish my presentation, I would say that in the case of France, there was this hospitality policy. It was not the case of Frankfurt, as I said, but there was really a lot of militants who were engaged to link with migrants. And what is really interesting is that family responsibility plays a central role in migration processes and for the decision to migrate. Moreover, since the end of labor migration, family reunification has been one of the essential forms of immigration in several European countries. In France, for example, in 2016, 50% of residence permits granted were for family reunification. And the family dimension also plays a major role in social integration and sometimes also in obtaining residence permits for people arriving in France as a family. However, members of the same family may have different rights, but the biographical evaluation by both fathers highlights that their migration is largely determined by caring for their children and shows the specific challenges that single parents face in terms of finding a place to stay, earning an income, and enabling their children to go to school. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for this very interesting presentation. First of all, I was not aware that there exists this biographical evaluation method, which for me seems to be very, very interesting and promising. I'm an administrative scientist and a political scientist by training, so very interesting because we often talk about the impact and how to capture impact of public policies, and effectively going on the level of an individual biographical experience seems to be very promising. And then the second part, which I found really interesting in your presentation, was this comparative approach of how different, let's say, tradition, how different local systems react on the phenomenon of migration. We can see maybe a more public actor-oriented approach, but please correct me if I'm wrong, on the French side, and a more civil society-oriented approach in Germany, which again dates back to, let's say, long traditions, because when it comes to local communities in Germany, this you can go back to the Middle Ages, where you had this old tradition. And very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I don't know, are there any questions on that? Maybe would anybody like to react directly? No, it's always a bit difficult with the director. Maybe we keep it for the moment like that and pass to Mechtel for her presentation. Then we may have the opportunity to discuss both presentations in the second step. So.
Yes, thank you very much. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, you can hear me well. So my name is Mechtel. I'm a professor of contemporary transnational history at the University of Luxembourg. And for today, I prepared a slide and a PowerPoint presentation, and I also have something in the chat I will refer to. I already put that in the chat. So title of my presentation today is Migration, Borderlands and International Law in 20th Century Continental Europe. So because I'm an historian, Birte Wassenberg really asked me to bring in the historical perspective on these Castle talks. And I will start with answering the question that was already raised by Bernhard Reiter in his opening speech, with the first thing to say that a historian would say that, relatively speaking, when compared to other periods of time, currently there is no migration crisis. There were more or a comparable number of migrants at other moments in the 20th century. What is rather at stake today, right now, is an implosion of the concept of crisis. Crisis has become the norm. We have a financial crisis, a migration crisis, a health crisis, and it is as if normality has become the exception. Now, this is a discourse I do not follow in my understanding of 20th century history. So what I propose is an understanding of the 20th century history as a very difficult marriage between two things. On the one hand, you have Europeans discovering humanitarianism, developing universal human rights, and really appreciate diverse cultures, which led to the development of international laws for refugees and European host societies accepting these refugees. But as I will argue today, the situation is context specific and can change, because the second element, the second partner in this different marriage is this nationalism. And in nationalism, a constant feature is in fact ethnic cleansing. So ethnic cleansing is a constant feature that is inherent to the nationalist ideology. And this brings a very interesting but very difficult tension that is always underway in the 20th century and which we see up until today. But let's start from the beginning. It's the origin of the word refugee, and I thought I would mention it today because it actually comes from French. So it's réfugié, which was used for the first time in order to refer to the persecution of Protestant Huguenots. In France, following the massacre in 1572, you actually had an edict of Nantes, which gave them religious liberty in France for almost 100 years, after which it was revoked in, this is 1685, it should be, not 1985. And this caused about 400,000 Huguenots to leave France as what was then called the world's first réfugiés, most left for England. But let's now jump to the 20th century, because that's what we are talking about today. And let's start with nationalism, because this was the prevailing political ideology of the century, preaching what Thomas Camurella has been referring to as normative isomorphism, which is the equation of one nation, one language, one religion. And this in itself, this desire to create this homogeneous nation states, comes with a consensus for the need of ethnic cleansing. And you see that already at the beginning of the 20th century during the Balkan Wars, where international diplomacy does not prevent ethnic cleansing, so people forcibly having to leave their country, but is actually, this diplomacy is allowing this kind of ethnic cleansing to escalate. And so during and after the First World War, we are already talking about 13 million people who are uprooted. And after the First World War, you have this predecessor of the United Nations, which comes into being, this supranational organ of the League of Nations. And it includes a High Commissioner for Refugees. And refugees is very much understood in political terms there. It was in order to prevent, take care of those who were fleeing for the Russian Revolution, so for communism in a way. And these people received stateless, they received the designation of being stateless, and they received internationally recognized refugee travel documents in the interwar years. But now the League of Nations also had to do something with borderlands, and in fact what is not always brought into the same picture is that more borderland inhabitants than people with refugee status saw their birth grounds switching state sovereignty after the First World War. And I have a book that comes out in March 2021, and you find the link in the chat, Peripheries at the Center. what I want to do there is I propose an understanding of the European continent between the First and the Second World War as thought in terms of borderlands, language, and children. So these are three crucial ideas for me that show that borderlands were really central spaces in order to understand European history. They were not peripheral. They may have been peripheral in geographical sense, but not in terms of political understanding. So what did the League of Nations do in interwar Europe? It actually put conditions on and supervised how East European states dealt with what was then conceived as their national minorities, mostly living in borderlands. So for example, they supervised how Poland was taking care of its German speakers on its territory, and it had like specific agreements for that, like the Minority Treaty or the Geneva Convention. I compared a Polish and a Belgian borderland in this book that comes out. And at first you could say that that the conclusions line up with what we already knew of the League of Nations, which is it was a paternalist institution because it required these East European states to take care of their national minorities, but it did not intervene in any way in how Western European countries were taking care of their minorities. But in a way, so you could say that Belgium did not need a League of Nations. In fact, it had a very, very nice system of taking care of minority rights. It was very much better protected than whatever the League of Nations had to offer in the interwar years. But what I say in this book is that it's too easy of a conclusion, so that if you dive deeper into historical sources, what you actually see is that Poles and not Belgians were interested in investing their money and resources into giving borderland children a chance of playing a new role in their country when they would grow up. And Belgians were in no way interested in improving life conditions of children or taking care of reforming their school systems and things like that. So it gives you a little bit perspective of how that interwar life looked like. I will go further to what happened just before the outbreak of the Second World War. This was Jewish refugees wishing to flee from persecution by Nazi Germany, and this was so there was a conference, Evian conference in 1938, which was trying to find a solution for that, and then they did not come to an agreement, which already showed that at that time countries were less willing to accept refugees just before the Second World War. And then in the 1940s, both during the Second World War and just afterwards, we really received this record height of people being on the move, and you have the little map there showing that most of it took place on the European continent. And already during the Second World War, in 1943, there was this United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration set up, and then it's turned into the International Refugee Organization just after the Second World War, which was then dealing with what it called at the time displaced persons, but today we would say these were refugees. And in 1950, this then changed in the UNHCR, which we still know today, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And then we have at the end of the 1940s, beginning of the 1950s, very, very important documents, agreements, international agreements that are being reached. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also the Geneva Refugee Convention, which was already referred to by a student this morning. Most people say 1951, yes, 1951 for Europe, but it also only applied to the rest of the world in 1967, which is often forgotten. And what makes these documents different from the kind of rights that were formulated in the years before the Second World War is that rights were given to individuals, not to minority groups, which was really the focus of interwar like refugee policy, minority policy in a way. And his refugee status was also limited to political refugees, so war or civil war was not a criterion, and this can be understood in this historical context because it was meant to protect people that were persecuted because of communism or national socialism. And another big difference after the Second World War with what happened before the Second World War is actually borderland inhabitants. Whereas in the interwar year, they were really considered to be, to receive protection, at least in Central and Eastern Europe, from this supranational organ of the League of Nations. After the Second World War, the only thing that was said is that a one-dimensional integration of European borderlands within their nation states was foreseen. So not that United Nations did not play a big role there any longer. So then you see, for example, this 12 million people fleeing to Germany after the Second World War. I will now make a short zoom in to show you more in detail how this looked like for children, in effect. So I will compare past and present because I think this is interesting for this audience. So the question here is how this discourse of the best interest of the child was used in case of unaccompanied refugee children. And I will refer to 3 articles that are already available online. The links are in the chat. And that's so they are already published online, but they have not yet been published in print. The print version will come in April 2021 in a special issue that I chief edited on borders and children. And I also wrote an introduction, and what I'm now going to say is actually in that introduction, which you will soon find online. And this is that, let's first look at the situation of these unaccompanied refugee children just after the Second World War. And here is a case study on Polish-Ukrainian borderland unaccompanied children in the late 1940s. And what you see is that this discourse of the best interest of the child, that it was used in a very flexible way. It was used in order to ignore the repatriation dictates to the Soviet Union, which was included in this international treaty of Yalta, and let more children emigrate to the West. So what was new at the time was that child protection was taking precedence over the right of a country over its children. Now, 2 other scientific articles show how this concept of the best interest of the child has been used more recently. So there is an anthropological study on this transit refugee camp in the Balkan corridor in 2015-2016. And there you can find how the camp functioned as a site where this concept of lone child and its best interests was defined and redefined in practice, and that children themselves turned out to be very competent social actors who could adjust their practices to these changing norms of what the best interest of the child actually meant. So you see a lot of flexibility here in how this concept was used at the time. And then the 3rd article is written by a philosopher. And this is a very critical analysis of this European return platform for unaccompanied minors, which was coordinated by northern countries, mostly in the European Union. He's very critical about how these unaccompanied minors are being portrayed as being at risk and how their deportation is presented as being in their best interest, as a way to empower displaced children. And what you see here is actually that this sentence of the best interest of the child receives a completely opposite meaning of what it had been given 70 years earlier, just after the Second World War. That now in this discourse, it's a nationalist goal. Nationalist goals are framed as universal child rights. So it's completely opposite in a way. So I wanted to give you an idea of what history could offer to an interdisciplinary debate in the specific case of refugee children and how that is framed. So much for what happened just after the Second World War. Let us still look very shortly to what happened in the Cold War and the Yugoslav War, and then we will come to a conclusion. So basically, migration continued in the Cold War in huge numbers. You have 500,000 people from Eastern and Central Europe moving to the US. You have 300,000 moving to the other side of Germany, so to speak. But this was not mostly not problematized because it was done quick, effectively, and it was framed, motivated by solidarity. And it was very interesting to see that as long as the border held, as long as there was a strong border, these refugees were portrayed as political victims, whereas from the moment on that these borders were softened, so to speak, then they were casted, were seen as legitimate economic migrants. And this is, I have from a book that will come out only in 2022, but we're working on it to have it published in a new book series in which I'm also involved, and you find the link also in the chat if you're interested in this book series. Now, then you have the Yugoslav Wars, and really the numbers of the people leaving Yugoslavia at the time for a better life elsewhere are very much comparable until today with the people that are moving currently and what is currently perceived as a migration crisis. And there, these refugees were not considered to be legal convention refugees because they left because of war, not because of a political reason, and often they only received a temporary refugee status. And then you have the development of new laws or new regulations in a way, and the EU Dublin Regulation has already been referred to this morning by Birte Vassenberg and Anja Bartel on asylum that needs to be applied for in the country of arrival. And you also have this invention of this existence of the right to remain at home, this kind of preventive protection, which contradicts with and essentially is also possibly undermines the right of seeking asylum, which is considered to be the right of an individual still in international law. So let me now come to my conclusion. So what I propose is a reading of 20th century history as indeed we do have a European legacy of liberal and moderate values included in international law, both which may again be in danger today. But what is also in danger, especially because an inherent characteristic of national ideology is actually ethnic cleansing, or, well, in a broader sense, intolerance for the other. And this is inherent to nationalism and comes specifically to the fore, is specifically visible in refugees, in how countries deal with their refugees and their borderlands. And here at the end, I will stop with finalize with a quote from a recent book on the history of refugees written by Philippe Deer, to say that which really focused on this contradiction, on the fact that this biggest drama, refugee drama, took place in the middle of Europe after the Second World War, and it really contradicts with putting ourselves forward as this nice humanitarian West, which really invented the UN Refugee Convention. That itself is a myth, and that we live with its tension. We have been living with this tension for the entire 20th century, and it's not very different, I think, today. So thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Magda. It was really interesting and constructive, I would say. It illustrates how useful it is to really indeed apply to different academic perspectives, a clear historical perspective, which you showed us, allows us to relativate things that in the media, in the current situation, may be interpreted in a wrong way, and a lot of details, a lot of wonderful examples that you gave us. Now, I see that there is somebody on the chat. I think Anne Hoffmann asked a question, and I think probably we could ask her directly to re-ask the question, because that was a question directly to Magda. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Joachim. I was just wondering, because we have heard about this also a lot of times, in the framework of cross-border cooperation, that actually refugee children, unaccompanied refugee children, change their behavior according to different regulations that are in place. And so, I was just wondering if you could give an example on that, maybe, if that's possible.
Yeah, so this text was not written by me, it was written by anthropologists. I can tell you what I remember from the text, but you can also read it yourself, of course. It's online, it's published. But in this, they really did this ethnographical research in this transit refugee camp on the Balkan corridor in 2015, 2016. What they said was there was a lot of chaos, a lot that people did not know which norms to implement, that there were a lot of different organizations coming in with their specific rules on how these unaccompanied minors needed to be taken care of, and that these, there was a lot of interaction, and with these unaccompanied minors, knowing that if they would present themselves as being of this age or this age, their chances would be completely different, or presenting themselves to this NGO or to another representative in the camp that could have different results. So this is a very general answer, and please don't quote me for that because it's not my research. So read the article. I would suggest to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Birte, I see you want to react maybe on.
Mechta, I'm profiting from her historical expertise. Mechta, do you think how important was the work of the League of Nations? You mentioned it in the whole issue of granting rights not only to children but in general to refugees, and who in the League of Nations was a leading force. You talked about Belgium as being particularly favorable, but I mean, are there any countries? Have you examined this, or is it is there not are there not leading countries who take this up as an issue to deal with, particularly after the First World War?
Yeah. So the League of Nations did different things, and this refugee policy, this passport I was referring to was also called the Nansen passport. So this was really this Nordic person, and it was very much coming from the north, so to speak. But this was a specific department within the League of Nations, as it is today in a way. The UN also has this HCR; it's a different building and so on. So the League of Nations was taking care of that, and it was also one of the mandates they had was to supervise how the rights of national minorities defined as a group were guaranteed by especially newly erected nation states in Central and Eastern Europe. So you have to think, after the First World War, it's the end of the empire on the European continent, and you have a lot of new nation states being erected in Central and Eastern Europe. And so the concern was that these nation states do not know how to take care of their national minorities, people mostly speaking other languages. It was mostly on the level of language as it was interpreted, and so they need help. Belgium was not in a way involved in it. Also, France could do with people in Alsace what they wanted, so to speak. To say with German-speaking Belgium. So no, Belgium was not very much in favor of that. But in a way, because you had language diversity in Belgium itself, it was not so difficult for Belgians to grant language facilities to German speakers in Belgium.
And the second question we have, I don't know whether you were already there this morning when we had the Julia showed the maps of the mental maps of the phantom borders. I mean, we were discussing it, Frédéric, and said that maybe the rise of because of the migration crisis or other European crisis, rise of Euroscepticism or nationalist views comes from the past. The maps seem to show a relationship with the communist bloc or the communist regimes. But do you think we can take this further back into history? Are there any phantom any borders that are, in your opinion, still significant for the whole migration issue and the different attitudes of states that we have seen throughout the students' presentations today towards the question of welcoming migrants or not?
Yeah, this is too specific. I can tell you, for what I know right now, yes, but it's certainly the case that mental maps are nothing new. You also had it in the past, and you also had people adjusting their behavior further in the past. I could give you one example. It's not completely related to refugees, but it has to do with borders. And this was, you had the big Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was really, really big. And then after the First World War, nowadays, territories that used to belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire are in 12 different countries. Yes, and so, for instance, if you look at Hungary, it's a small country, and you had a lot of Hungarian speakers on the other side of the border. So what happened at the beginning of the 1920s is people still needed to get used to what a border is and how it actually functions. And you had smuggle activities, which were really, really prevalent, especially people having like land on two sides of the border, and they didn't understand it in terms of smuggling, so to speak. Yes, and then what you see after the Second World War, then there is a communist regime with really, really closed borders, and that these smuggling routes from the interwar years are still reactivated, so to speak, in the communist time, because it was already a practice to do it. So why not continue it under another political regime? So this is an example of such a practice, but it's not specifically related to refugees. I could very much think of the fact that has already been researched, but I don't have it in my head right now.
Yeah, maybe Julia wants to react. Maybe, are you online, Julia?
Yes, I am here. Yeah, thank you, Joachim. I just wanted to share with you one of my fundamental concerns regarding nationalism, because Magda, in her presentation, which I enjoyed a lot, it was very interesting. She underlined the very crucial aspect of nationalism, which is about the ethnic cleansing. However, as if we follow the history of the nation state in Europe, we can find a lot of very interesting testimonies of the fundamental interconnectedness of basic freedom and integrating nation states. Like John Stuart Mill wrote in his study on representative government in 1861 that it seems that one of the fundamental criteria of the existence of free institutions in a country is that the borders of the state and borders of the nations should be coincide. So there is an aspect of ethnic cleansing, which is at the same time, in parallel, is the criterion of freedom. So these two aspects seem to me very conflictuous, and I'm very interested. I'm very curious about Magda's opinion on this aspect, that even in the 20th century, Ralph Dahrendorf stated that, okay, there is no democracy outside nation states. Or we know the Roderick's trilemma. If we would like to create a democracy, then we need nation states. Otherwise, if we concentrate on globalization, we will lose the democratic institutions, and so on and so on. So there is something very, very fundamental interconnectedness between freedom and nation. However, we are aware of the fact mentioned by Magda that nation states are interested in some kind of ethnic cleansing, if I understand well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I do not consider myself a theoretical historian. I am an empirical historian, so I look at sources, and then I sometimes like to think with theory in order to understand my sources, but I'm not a person using a theory and testing it on the sources, so to speak. So what I will do in order to answer your question is to show you the example of Poland, for example, throughout the 20th century, where you really, really see big changes. So when it appeared on the map of Europe, which was just after the First World War, it hadn't been there for more than 100 years. It was called a nation state, but it didn't differ very much from the kind of empirical regimes that had been present before, because 1/3 of the population did not speak Polish, so to speak. You had a lot of different religions and so on. So this was in a way very, very far away from this idea of one nation, one language, one religion. And you had ideas, political ideas, two very big political families. The one that was really going for this equation, national language.
At the end of the castle talks, but it's normally during the first day, and you have an aperitif afterwards. So all this, of course, we won't have, but please stay on for our final panel, which is the panel where I wanted to kind of put a little bit my past students or my PhD students to participation. And I'm very pleased to say that William Lasser from Clemson University is also the panel that's supposed to open up a little bit to the more international questions of migration, maybe not only, but we have done this also during the Castle talk. Some of the groups have worked also on the international level. But I'm very pleased that William Lasser, I'm really pleased that William Lasser from Clemson University has volunteered to chair this panel, because I must admit that me and Frederique, because Frederique has also done a lot of co-animation during the day. We are a little bit tired for us, it's of course the end of the day. Bill, for you, it's the beginning of the day still. So you're still quite fresh. And I'm very happy that I can lay this panel into your hands for presiding it. Just 2 words that you might not know. Céline Leflour is is a student that's interesting for the Border Studies Master. She's in fact from the promotion of last year of the master, and she has done a master thesis with me together, and in co-direction with Catherine Delcroix. I don't know whether Catherine is still here. So for the students of this year, it might be interesting to see, what you come up with when you do a master thesis. And Claude Beaupré is my student in co-tutel with Emmanuel Bruno-Jailly from Victoria UVic University in Canada. And she's working on migration issues and perception of the migration crisis in the Canadian press. We also had already the question of media. And now I will no longer talk and let Bill take over from here.
Very good. Well, thank you. And Berta, before we start, are we still on the same schedule to end in an hour, or should we try to end by 7 o'clock your time?
No, I don't know about the students, but I think we are a little bit flexible. It's not like we have the room, from 7 o'clock is taken by somebody else. So we are flexible. You can manage that as you like, and as it depends also on the questions, because we want to have some time for discussion. I don't want to cut on the discussion, so we can go 10-15 minutes past 7. If we need to, no problem, but we can also finish at 7 if you feel that, there are no more questions. I'll just let you manage that in a very flexible way.
Okay, love it. Thank you so much. Well, greetings from the United States. It's really nice to see at least some faces and names of people, friends from Strasbourg. I wish we weren't separated by COVID-19 these days. And it's a pleasure to be here and to chair this final panel, since we political scientists and citizens of the United States have nothing else going on this week of any importance. So I'm pleased to see our 2 participants, Claude Beaupré and Céline Lafleur, and I will give them each 20 minutes to speak. So if you could, it's difficult to police the time from 5,000 miles away. So if you would please just kind of keep track of that yourselves, and then we'll have time for discussion and questions afterward. Our panel today focuses, as Dr. Vosburg said, on international issues. Claude Beaupré works with issues, perceptions of migration issues in the European Union in Canada, and Céline Lafleur on the impact of environmental issues and concerns on migration. And so I think we will go according to the schedule, which is that Céline Lafort will go first. So.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. So let me just put the slide. Okay, do you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. So as Mrs. Wassenberg said, I'm Céline Lafort from the International Relations master's degree, and I'm here today to present my master's thesis on migration, development and adaptation to environmental changes in Ecuador and Senegal. So I led this work in the Hugo Observatory, a research center which studies a link between migration, the environment, and politics. And I tried to look at the place of environmental factors and the migration decisions. And so maybe you wonder why I'm talking about environmental change and not about climate change, which a term that we are more used to hear about. Just because I'm talking about a broader category than environmental changes, which include, of course, climate changes, but also environmental degradations and disasters. And so I use the definition of the Foresight report that environmental change are changes in the physical and geochemical environment on a large scale, either caused naturally or influenced by human activities, whether by fast or slow growing events. And there are also a lot of expressions to refer to people displaced for environmental reasons. Maybe you've heard about eco-migrants or climate migrants or environmental refugees. And I choose the definition of the International Organization of Migration about environmental migrants, which are defined as persons or group of persons who, mainly for reasons related to sudden or gradual environmental change, negatively affecting their life or living condition, are forced to leave their usual home or leave it on their own initiative, temporarily or permanently, and who as a result move within or out their country. So these definitions brings us a really broad spectrum of displacements and migration that can be by the own initiative of the people, or that they are forced to flee, and they are sometimes permanent, but sometimes really short, that the migrant come back really shortly after their displacement to their home community. And so at the heart of my thesis, I evaluated the potential of migration for development and adaptation to environmental change. And so I use the definition of the UNDP for human development, which is defined as a process of enlarging people's choices in various sectors, such as education, health, and human rights, for example. And I choose the definition of the International Panel for Climate Change for adaptation, because it enables us to see migration as one of the beneficial opportunities of adaptation. And so my research question is, what role does mobility, so both internal or international, play in populations and governments strategies for adapting to environmental changes in Senegal and Ecuador? So let's see a bit of the international context of this work. So I decided to start in 1972 because this is when the first UN conference on environment took place. And this is when environment became a political subject in international and regional discussions. And by then, a lot of reports showing the importance of the interaction between migration and environment has been presented in the UN institutions. The best known are Dr. El Henawi's and Dr. Myers ones, because they try to bring a definition of what is migration related to environmental changes, and more specifically climate change. But it is only in 2010, at the Cancun Conference on Climate Change, that the migration was recognized as an adaptation strategy to climate change. And by then it became a really important subject in the frame of the International Conference on Climate Change. And I stopped in 2018 because this is where the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration was adopted by a majority of United Nations countries. And it is really a step towards a binding international treaty which would grant protection and rights to environmental migrants. So human mobility in the context of environmental change is a really complex thing, because we are often confronted to a binary discourse on migration, presenting on one side economic migrants or political refugees, but in reality, migration factors are really numerous. We can name social, political, economic, demographic, and environmental factors. And in each of its factors, environmental changes can act as a multiplier effect and can induce the decision to migrate. And there are also individual, so micro-social factors that can influence the decision of people, such as age, sex, family, or religion, and also the context, which is called, in terms of push and pull factors, for example, the political context, migration costs, or the networks the migrant can have in its community of destination. These are the various factors that will act in the decision to migrate or stay. So both Ecuador and Senegal are facing major environmental changes and risk. They are both slow onsets or sudden onsets. Slow onsets such as sea level rise, which obviously concerns the coast of the country. Glacier melting, which concerns the Andes region, and sudden onsets such as rainfall variation, which is more about the Amazonian region, and seismic and volcanic hazards, which are more concerning the Andes part as well. In Senegal, there are similar environmental changes as Ecuador, for example, sea level rise or rainfall variation. But it is also impacted by rising temperatures, most of all in the northern part of the country, and by disasters such as floods or droughts. And these major environmental changes have huge influence on humans' livelihoods and activities, and they impact it negatively. And for example, in the region of Fouta Toro in the north of Senegal, land degradation has been a cause of departure for a lot of people that are moving, for example, to the capital Dakar or neighbor countries, or sometimes towards Europe. And in the Ecuadorian Amazonia, floods, such as in the Sarayacus community, are forcing people to flee, and most of the time in really near locations such as other towns in the Amazonian regions or the neighbor country Colombia. And this is why we are talking about the link between migration, development, and adaptation, because when people migrate, they can then benefit to their communities of origin, of destination, and it can be beneficial for themselves as well. For example, migrants' remittances or the knowledge, education they get abroad or in their community of destinations, or the networks they create in their communities of destination can be really beneficial for their community of origin, for example, their families that are still home. For example, it can be with income and activities diversification, because the money they receive from the migrant can help buying new crops or to begin with livestock, for example, and they can also be sensibilized to climate change issues because they can learn things in their community of destination and then bring it back home. And they also contribute to the construction of infrastructures that are really important for the development of the country, such as schools and health centers. These are some concrete examples of my case studies. So, for example, in Gali, northern Senegal, in the region of Matam, the money of the remittances of the migrants have been useful for the construction of water tanks, and there have been investments in renewable energies with the solar panels, for instance. And it has been also useful to cover livestock feed costs, which is really high, most of all in periods where the agriculture is really affected by environmental shocks. And in Ecuador, in the province of Azuay, in the south of the country, the construction of greenhouses has helped diversifying as well the agricultural sector. So as I said, this migration benefits both, not both, but to migrants themselves, because when they migrate, if it is successful, if they are secure, they can emancipate, access to a new social and economic statute, and feel better. And maybe they have access to better education as well in their communities of destination, because they feel sometimes a gap in the labor market because they accept jobs that are quite depreciated by the locals. And their communities of origin, because for all the reasons I mentioned before, because they, with their remittances and knowledge, they really participate to the development of their home countries. And so for my research work, I use a qualitative methodology. I interviewed some 10 people, mainly development actors from NGOs, embassies, or national development agencies. I obviously been reading a lot of academic and scientific literature. I've been analyzing national development adaptation plans and programs, and also international conventions. And lastly, I analyzed development programs and projects. So the main findings of this research work, well, first of all, that despite the increasing occurrence of the terms migration, adaptation, development in both international and regional discussions, the link between the three appears really little in the Senegalese and Ecuadorian discourse and public policy. For instance, in the Ecuadorian National Plan for Development, The only relation between migration and climate change was a negative one, because it was the positive correlation between increased migration and degradation of the environment. And in Senegal, the reference to climate change was only in the economical aspect, because it mentioned that the impact of climate change was really huge on some economic sectors. And so secondly, the link between human mobility and adaptation appears less obvious than the migration development nexus for political decision makers and co-development actors. So this is one of the main results of the interviews I have been leading. So for instance, when I talked to a project manager of an NGO in Fatick in northern Senegal, he was really telling that he couldn't make any link between migration and adaptation to climate change, but development and migration were really linked to him. So while they are also linked, adaptation and development. And also I found that in regions that have a really strong tradition of emigration or immigration, the socialization to migration influences migration decisions and coping strategies when there is an economic crisis or an environmental shock. So for example, in the Ecuadorian provinces of Azuay and Cañar in the south of the country, that have a really strong tradition of immigration since 1950s, when there were economic crises, mostly in the late 90s, it was the first strategy to emigrate for people who had the means, economic possibility. And so it is, to me, an influence of this tradition. And in Senegal, the regions of Louga and Diourbel, so were particularly socialized to immigration since the independence of the country. And it was also one of the first coping strategies for when environmental shocks happened, to emigrate towards another city nearby. And last but not least, I found that there are lots of discrepancies between the needs and the expectation of local population and national positions on migration issues in the context of environmental change. So this mainly, for example, in Senegal, in the region of Matam, there are a lot of public policies to fix the population, and this for the government means development, but the population are expecting more facilities to migrate. And in Muisne, it's an island in the Ecuadorian province of Esmeraldas, in the northern part of the country. People are expecting to reconstruct the island and to adapt to environmental risk in situ, but the government is leading a relocalization policy towards the continent, and so in very poor conditions. So the expectation and the response of the government are not the same. So to conclude, migration can be an effective strategy for development and adaptation in the context of environmental change when it is a trajectory made in a secure environment, and when the migrant itself in his community of destination and back home feels that his trajectory has been successful and didn't feel like he had a really bad experience. And I think it will be interesting to focus on local authorities, because they expressed will to learn more about this issue and to work with local people and with the diaspora to improve the development of the communities. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be pleased to answer your question if you have some.
Thank you very much, and appreciate it, and thank you for staying very precisely within the time frame. If you have questions, please put them in the chat now, and then we'll get back to them, but I want to make sure that Claude Beaupré also has time for her presentation, since we're kind of at the end here. So let me turn to her, and again for 20 minutes, and then again, please put questions in, and I'll go back to the chat and ask those questions just as soon as both of our speakers have had an opportunity. So to Claude Beaupré again for a 20-minute.
Actually, I have prepped for about 10-15 minutes. So if you want to do, my topic is completely unrelated. So if you want to do questions for her now, it might benefit.
All right, that'd be great. Then we have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. I can't necessarily see everyone, so if I don't call on you, put it in the chat or just shout. I'd like to ask a question. It's interesting that you see sort of positive outcomes from these crises and disasters. I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the possibility of sort of gaining the benefits without having to go through the crisis or disaster. So would there be ways to structure some of the policies to bring out positive outcomes without waiting for an environmental crisis?
It is obvious that it would be very great not to have to think about how to see migration as an adaptation strategy and feel like there is no necessity to adapt, because but it would be really idealistic, because of course there will be more and more disasters and environmental degradations. So I guess maybe first of all the more important thing is to adapt in situ, like to adapt first with local people and to address environmental change at a local level, because it is I think the more adapted scale to respond to these issues. But I guess as it is true that well, both of these countries, but a lot of countries have huge diasporas. It is like a resource we have, and why won't we use it to this end? So I don't know if I am answering your question, but the idea is that like migration is an available resource that we have to respond to this issue, among others, obviously. But this is why I found it was interesting to talk about it in this context.
Sure. Now, I was thinking perhaps about policies to prevent environmental problems or mitigate them before they reach the crisis stage.
Like, for example, in communities depending on agriculture, first of all, it is about using methods that are respectful from the environment. For example, agroecology. And this I saw a lot in Ecuadorian communities, that it was like natural to adapt, and there was no need to planify something to make a transition towards agroecology. Like, it was something natural. If they were seeing some environmental signs that something was going wrong or the environment being degraded, they were automatically trying to find ways to be more in line with the environment and more respectful. So this for communities depending on agriculture. And then also in cities, because this is one of the main issue in this in the environmental question. For example, coastal cities that are facing sea level rise. The problem is that a lot of people are internally migrating towards these cities, and so they are growing, and so they are becoming more and more near from the sea. So maybe it will be like policies of urbanization or social policies that would enable people to be to migrate in secured zones and zones that are not environmentally at risk. This would be one of the possibilities, for instance.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Bill, if I might just say something, because I've been piloting the thesis of Céline together with Catherine Delcroix, and what we found really original was, or maybe it is not so much original, but with all this focus that we have currently on the migration crisis in Europe or even in America as well, you end up seeing migration really as a negative factor all the time. It's something negative. It's a problem. and for in the thesis of Céline, she has taken it the other way around. She has shown, and Mechthild, she's left now, but Mechthild has actually seen this from the historical perspective beforehand in her presentation about, from the history of post First World War, even before, that migration is also a positive factor, seen as something which can give an asset to the migrants, but also to those who welcome them, but also to the community back where they come from. So they might go back. I mean, migrants might go back, but they might also stay in the country of destination and then transfer the money, so that that's what she showed in her thesis. And so this adaptation and this positive also economic effect of migration is something that, we've been listening this morning to a presentation by Noriko from Japan, and Frédéric and myself, when Noriko showed us the numbers of asylum application positively received by Japan in 2017, for the whole of Japan, it was 20. They have about 19,000 demands, and they accepted 20, 0.1%. And so, and for the Japanese, definitely, migration is just not a question. They don't want any migrants, but they need them because they have an aging population. And we had this program with Emmanuel Bruno-Jailly from Canada on migrant issues, and the Japanese were partners, and they realized that they have to change their policies. But this means also changing the perception of migration. And I thought this was good to especially show in the case of Céline with regard to also development policies. She hasn't said this so much in the presentation today, but in her master thesis, which is a very long master thesis, she has actually shown also because she has talked a lot with the people also from coming from French ONGs helping, or development agencies helping development projects in these countries, and to see also the link, between development policies from the West and the whole migration issue. It's and also, the last part, original thing is, of course, this environmental migration issue, which the UN has only recently recognized as an issue, and which is new, and which I think in Canada also there is another PhD student working on these issues of environmental migration, which is also something that only recently has been taken charge of in the international community. So I think it was a good thing to introduce this into this discussion on the whole migration crisis in Europe, because we've been the whole of the day. Julia is still with us, but with the perception of some of the countries in Europe on migration as really being almost an evil thing, which can also have very positive effects.
Thank you. And Celine, there's a request for the PowerPoint, so you might respond to that in the chat, or perhaps
yes,
those
of course.
more general. Thank you. And we'll turn to Club of Play now on
well, on this upbeat note, now I feel terrible for saying let's go last because I'm going to ruin the mood all over again. Going back to immigration can be problematic without it being a problem. Yeah, so on Club of Play, I am Dr. Vassenberg's guinea pig in the joint PhD program between the University of Strasbourg and the University of Victoria. So my work from my MA, which I also did with her, has always centered around the refugee crisis. So the refugee migrant crisis, what I call the RMC. And today, when I realized I was the last one, I decided that I've always focused from a media perspective, but today I was like, well, let's try a different approach. And I've allowed myself to build upon like all the presentations that were here today and synthesize what is more of a systemic regional understanding of the RMC according to the research that I've done. I do feel like I go a bit further than what's been presented today. With the conclusion that the EU is a multinational polity. Like, how has the EU as a multinational polity reconciled what appears to be dialectically opposing attitudes from its member states in response to the unusual influx of asylum seekers that happened in 2015-2016? Now, I know that Professor Vassenberg said at the beginning that for her, the RMC is 2015. In my research, I view it as happening between 2015 and 2016, starting in April 2015 after the sinking of 5 boats and the loss of 2,000 lives, which fueled media captivation, and arguably ending with the EU-Turkey deal in March 2016, when the media attention dwindled. So all in all, in those 13 months between 2015 and 2016, 2.3 million people were said to have made their way to Europe. Oh, hold up. That would help. Okay, sorry. Yes, 2.3 people were said to have made their way to Europe in hope of gaining asylum, a significant number, as you can see on the chart here. On a more systemic level, however, one of the main outcomes of the RMC was the sharp rise in attention towards human migration, yes, brought forward by sensational media hype, but leading to a mixture of regional and national debates within the immigration, identity, and security, most of which are still ongoing today. And this was clearly prevalent today in the multiple presentations. There you go. So how did Europe, so this in mind, how did Europe, and I'm saying Europe, but I really mean the EU member states, tackle this unusual influx? So yes, 2.3 million is a lot, and it was unusually high, but if you think of it, it actually counts to 0.2% of Europe's overall population of 510 million. Now, before I lose you, I know I cannot see you, and some of you might be piqued by this. Let me make myself clear. I am in no way attempting to diminish or make light the realities of what occurred in 2015, 2016. These were trying times. For Greece, Italy, and Hungary, to name a few of the examples that were given today, gaining thousands of incomers daily while administering to those that were already present truly did push national capacities to a breaking point. That being said, the RMC chiefly affected these handful of countries that are here listed, the top 6, plus Greece, obviously. But these top 6 countries accounted for 80% of asylum claims processing, leaving the vast majority of Europeans and European countries in turn with no concrete firsthand experience of what was perceived as the RMC, other than mediated reports and the political captivation that ensued. So looking at the 0.2% figure of the 510 million people, along with the sporadic or at least unequal nature of the RMC, leads me to think that the crisis component of the RMC had more to do with the regional inefficiency, inability, and or unwillingness to handle the unusual influx, rather than the influx itself. As such, the RMC is first and foremost a systemic challenge to Europe and the EU especially, one that had been anticipated and one that remains to be fully addressed to this day. At a regional level, so I'm saying this very briefly, and I know it's been developed throughout the day, so we're quite familiar with it already, with the Schengen Agreement, the Amsterdam Treaty, and how the CEAS was generated in response to the Eastern and West migrant flow post Cold War, and that the Dublin system is one of the main components of this, the common European asylum system, which we all know. It's devised to eliminate all confusion and contention related to asylum processing between member states, and establishes the state responsible for the examination, which we know as the first country of entry within the EU. So that being said, as was also very well explained, the Dublin system creates systemic inequalities because of geographic positioning, leaving Italy and Greece, for example, to be more affected by the RMC than like northernmost countries. Consequently, as the reception and protection of asylum applicants are viewed as a burden on receiving countries due to financial, administrative, social, and political implication, it has rendered this registration of asylum hopefuls to be viewed as an encumbrance, which can create significant backlogs in portal countries, which we know, which results in well-documented instances of asylums asylum hopefuls actively bypassing the first country of entry clause, which was known as asylum shopping, which was shown today in Anya Bartel's presentation with the different testimonies of migrants. And for the member states themselves, they were at times actively refusing to register asylum claims and simply allowing and encouraging individuals to transit through the country in stark violation of international and EU law. So in a very simplistic and colloquial sense, the CES is a prime example of great in theory can be messy in practice. So much that some critics have called it this inherent systemic inequality and the resulting non-compliance to be the result of a mechanism of organized non-responsibility through which non-binding aspect of the CES, or the soft framework, as Petya Tsvetanova this morning explained, chiefly this soft framework of being non-binding, allows some member states to simply turn a blind eye to their struggling counterparts, while others take it upon themselves to take in more than is theoretically expected of them, as long as they're willing to. To better illustrate this organized non-responsibility idea, I've created what I'm hoping is a clear, albeit very general and diminutive timeline of the RMC. That's the green line from beginning to end, along with the timeline of every major initiative that was suggested in response to the influx, and that's the yellow line. As you can see, along the yellow line, I have divided the initiatives that were proposed at the EU level in two categories: those aimed at mitigating the organized non-responsibility within the EU internally, those are red, and those I'm helping the curb of the influx from outside the continent externally, those are in blue. I'm not going to explain externalization because this was so well done earlier by a group. Next to three of the decisions, I have put in green like a cancel or X mark. And these are decisions that were proposed that have failed, that are seen as failed, either because they failed to muster the necessary unanimous support and were never actually implemented, or were attempted but failed to create the desired outcome due to the aforementioned soft framework of non-binding. I was going to go into more detail, but I do feel like to those that have been here all day, you've known these to death by now. These are the safe third country list, which was dropped because of futile discussions over which countries should be added. The relocation scheme, which was met with staunch opposition by the Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Czech Republic, and the fairness mechanism similarly met with similar opposition. As such, the only international plan, the only internal plan within the EU that had significant follow through and fewer objections was the erection of migrant reception and processing hotspots in both Greece and Italy, which is very telling in and of itself. Now, of course, there's a wide array of complex and nuanced reasons as to why each of those initiatives fails. Let's keep in mind that by 2015, the EU was still reeling from increasingly frequent terrorist attacks since 2006, the 2008 financial crisis, the Greek debt crisis of 2010, the Crimea-Ukraine crisis of 2014, along with increasing support of right-wing nativist political parties, agitating European Union politics, and Euroscepticism. But the main element to remember here, and this is also a callback to this morning's group presentation on the externalization of the EU border, is the lion's share of EU's initiatives towards the RMC resulted in externalization of the response. This is how one came to end up with the EU-Libya deal, NATO patrolling the agency, and the EU-Turkey deal. Okay. It remains interesting to see, in any case, that comparisons are being made about how the EU chose to tackle the financial crisis by coming together and choosing to sacrifice national control over their banking system to save the euro, versus how member states face the RMC by choosing to fall back on national measures such as border control fences to contain human flows. These decisions were issue specific. When it came to migration, member states chose to sacrifice part of the functionality of the Schengen rather than limit their national decision making. That was not the case for the euro crisis. In 1978, Jean Monnet famously said, "Europe will be forged in crisis and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises." And I think that's become evident that in relation to the RMC, EU solidarity has fallen short. It's mentioned time and again today, and it still does to this day. Yes, just last year in April 2020, the lack of solidarity between member states manifested itself in the European Court of Justice in a ruling against Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary for non-compliance with its migrant relocation obligations, suggesting a failure in the countries to respond to the emergency situation. And the main thing to remember here, it was seen as a failure to provide relief, especially to Greece and Italy, with the exceptional burden, aka a lack of solidarity. But as Véronique Vérade said today, and I think it has to be said time and again, to assume that solidarity is mandatory is nonsense. We must not confuse solidarity with responsibility. And she is right. The CAS is built on a soft framework. And for that very reason, especially as it tackles something as sensitive and divisive as immigration or migration, where does this leave us? In comparing the EU's response to the financial crisis in the RMC an even worthwhile endeavor? The financial policies and migration policies are not the same domain. They do not strike the same emotional chord, nor strike the same discourse. So while the RMC demonstrates cracks within the EU's regional integration as it currently stands, some have even argued, and this is definitely subject to debate, and I really hope we do have time to debate this, even though I know we're running short on time, is that beyond this inherent mechanism, organized non-responsibility, the RMC has even seemed to demonstrate a form of organized hypocrisy within the EU, one deliberately aimed at compensating for some unreconcilable differences by allowing a gap between member state ambition and regional action. It's a gap that's allowed the EU to uphold its normative standards of appropriateness at a level of talk and decision, while respecting the sovereign limits imposed by recalcitrant member states. While some view this as problematic, one may argue that it is a necessary evil or a necessary status quo in maintaining such a large, complex, divided polity as the EU. I don't know where I personally stand on the issue, but I do think it's an interesting point that needs to be brought up and discussed. So I leave it to everyone else to comment on this. I know we're depressed again. I'm really sorry. We should have left it at environmental refugees.
Okay, thank you. In the Victorian era in England, at the end of a tragedy, Shakespearean tragedy or otherwise, the actors would sing a happy song in order to leave the audience with a good response. So maybe
I'm glad to see you, but I will not sing.
Okay, all right. I mean, I wanted to ask, sort of as a way of perhaps bringing a glimmer of positivity back. Do you see a way out of this? And maybe that's a question for everyone. But is it a strengthening of the sort of a diminution of national sovereignty in these areas? Hence, a strengthening of the EU in some way. Is it? I mean, what would you say is any way out?
Well, now we're like leaning towards Euroscepticism. I'm not sure. I'd love to hear what anyone else has to say.
Yeah. Well, or the opposite, right? A strengthening of Europe as opposed to
or yes.
Yeah, weakening of Europe. Any comments? I know it's late.
I know.
But this is perhaps a topic for a wonderful discussion, a longer and a wonderful discussion later on, I think. Questions? All right, I will turn back. Thank you very much. It's very interesting, and I do think that it's perhaps appropriate to kind of take up this set of issues, perhaps in a comparative context, as we look at sort of the operation of these federal or quasi-federal systems are quite interesting. So I'll turn it back to Dr. Wassenberg. Thank you.
Yeah, just maybe one thing, because Claude, I mean, she has, because the topic today was the migration crisis in Europe, she's prepared, I think, this is actually because you actually touched on all the things that we've been talking about during the day, so you did a good job. But Claude's thesis is about media perception in Canada. And what's interesting is when you look at her, for example, master thesis, for example, is how far-reaching the migration crisis in Europe is also on the other side of the Atlantic, and how it affects, in fact, the way how you talk about migrants and about migrant issue, and even, I mean, we have not got so far in the thesis, in the PhD thesis, but it's also just to see whether it actually even could affect national policies. Even in Canada, for example, where the situation is, of course, different. But I think that's what's interesting in her PhD thesis is actually the lenses through the media and the global impact that the media can have on a crisis which is localized. That 2015, 2016 was in Europe. So that's fascinating. And she has done, which I have approached her in the master thesis a little bit because I'm a historian, is she has done this on the basis of quantitative research, also qualitative now, of course, but and the master thesis was mainly enormous quantitative research with, quoting the number of journals that talked about migration crisis and about certain words, certain terms. That's fascinating if you analyze that with this methodology, and to see what impact. So it's also all about perception, and in Europe, of course, the perception also leads to things like Euroscepticism, which we've discussed today. But I mean, in Canada, it's not Euroscepticism. It's also more about the perception of migrants, because Canada is normally a welcoming country considering migrants. I mean, it should not talk in place of Claude, because she knows this issue now much better than I do. But I think so. This is why I also think that the migration issue is extremely complex, because you have the facts, you have the figures, and as Claude showed, maybe the figures were not even that important for Europe. But then you have the perception. The perception was enormous. Everybody in 2015-16 in Europe just talked about the migration crisis. It seemed to be the crisis. I mean, even put the terrorist crisis almost into shadows at one point. And so if you look at the figure, so it was completely exaggerated also by the media. There was a problem, but I think this is very important when you talk about these things, to see. You can even, Bill, you could even, this is all the role of the media. You could even talk about other issues in international relations. Look at all what's happening in the US. I mean, all the media coverage is always extremely important. The storm of the Capitol. Would you believe how in Germany that was? The media, the weight of the images and the texts in the media. A representation gives the impression of a major world crisis, which it also amplifies the problems, and we have to, and that's what Claude researching about, and I think it's an important issue when you talk about migration as well, because we've been talking a lot today. The whole day was about also about, about figures and about also about legal aspects, which are really important, and sometimes also about perception. When we talked about Euroscepticism, that's extremely important, I believe. But it could be another castle talk. That could be
anytime.
Anytime. Yeah, I know that Claude is always. I'm very touched also by the fact that that these crises kind of tie the students, the PhD students, and the former master students to to what we're doing at Sciences Po. With Frédéric, with Joachim had to leave now. We are dealing with these crises. It's a Jean Monnet project, and so it's supported by the European Union. So I think that's a good way also to kind of have almost a border research group on the issue, which and for the students that I have this year in the master, it's a good way to see what you can what you can make it out of a study on these things. Okay, let me conclude. It's been a long day for us and all, and I would now profit to I thank of course all the presenters, the researchers, the PhD students, but I would like to thank the students also, because they have been like us on the screen all day. It's not an easy year for them, because they have all their courses online, and now they have the castle talks are normally a nice event. Bill, you know this. Claude, you know it as well. Frédéric, you know it. We are in the chateau. We are in the nice surroundings, and I almost thought this time I had so many problems that when the former Minister President of the German-speaking community of Belgium, Karl-Heinz Lambert, the former President of the Committee of Regions, came to the castle. Well, and the first times he came to the castle, he was talking about the ghost of cross-border cooperation, and this made me think of the term castle talks on cross-border cooperation, which I have been doing for now almost 10 years, and. Would you believe it? I mean, this castle talk, should have taken place in March, but I have had so many obstacles that with Frédéric yesterday evening at 11 o'clock, when the third person was saying, I can't do this tomorrow and I can't be there, I said, I'm sure there is a ghost. And the ghost is annoyed that we are not having the castle talk in the castle. And this is why we have so many problems for the castle talk. I was convinced that we have this ghost, and the ghost wants us to come back. And I think Bill would like to come back as well in presence of the chateau. He knows it very well as well. And I'm sorry for the students. They also have the master class, which is going to be virtual. Everything is virtual. They have problems for their traineeships. So, I can even give you an appeal here for those who are not the students. But if you have any ideas for